All right, here we are together, everyone, everywhere, and appreciate the open ears and our chance to talk about the mental obsession and life, which is really largely about sanity and starting to see that emotional sobriety, sanity in sobriety terms, is being free from any compulsive, symptomatic, any symptomatic compulsion would be a decent definition of that. Within sobriety, emotional sobriety is starting to recognize that sanity is a natural occurring state that we struggle with, and that it isn't anything shy of sanity that we're actually struggling with. So if the ideas we have about life are not correct and we manage them as though they are and try to maintain them as though they are, the inner conflict that's created is automatic. And it wouldn't be that way if we didn't have some greater sense of knowing. That conflict would not exist. It would seem normal and acceptable, and we wouldn't have to be numb and ignore and fight and deny to maintain it. Wouldn't happen.
How do you know that?
Well, because it doesn't seem to, just from experience. It just doesn't seem to. So the months, we're going to start looking at the steps and the traditions. And step 3 is about a decision to act principally, decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of whatever that power is, whatever it is. We don't have to understand it because it even tells us that. The God of our understanding, but it can also be misunderstood by our understanding and still work. The fact that we begin to think beyond the self we think we are seems to be the freeing component in the steps. We call it a spiritual nature. We can call it anything we want, but if it is and it exists and it's absolute, then it is what it is, regardless of what we call it. So it isn't the thinking about it and the limitations we impose on it. It's a simple consideration of it that seems to give us that result, John, as far as my experience has been with, hundreds, maybe even more than that in terms of people I've worked with and seen.
Yeah, I'm not doubting your experiences. I'm just trying to understand, because what I see as these steps in AA are permission-giving devices. So it's the creation of a permission-giving device to make you feel a different way, to make you, I don't know what the word you used just now, but anybody?
Natural?
No, you used, no, in that your last sentence, somebody help me. Anyway, so what happens is that we find a device whereby we can become something other than we are at this point at this juncture. Say we're not sober.
Transformation.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you. So those are permission-giving devices, and I don't think they're any more than that.
Okay. So the basis of our discussion, the basis of the steps are principles. And if principles are not negotiable because they underline the functional capacity of the entire universe, then there may be something beyond the thinking we do about them that is much more profoundly knowing than the thinking we do about things. And I would say if that's the nature of existence, it isn't a function of permission. It's a function of us beginning to recognize the actual nature of our existence, rather than see that we've been looking to create a nature that hasn't been natural. And to think of it in terms that oppose the actual nature of reality and truth would be to think of it in ways that are very conflicted and very difficult and very much a struggle. And I would say that's pretty emblematic of what I find people in sobriety doing, but not just people in sobriety. People in my life beyond sobriety tend to have emotional struggles, tend to be reactive, tend to be defensive, tend to be irritated, tend to be discontent, tend to have issues going on that are not always traceable because collectively we've been normalized this idea that who we are is what we think and all we are is what we think. And if that basic flaw has been gnawing at us, we have not been paying attention to that gnawing consequence as anything other than, well, that's life. Life's difficult. Life's complicated. No, it isn't. Life is not complicated at all. Seems to be operating perfectly everywhere else but on Earth. Doesn't seem to be in any conflict. It seems to be interacting perfectly according to whatever the design is. Whatever it knows to do, it does. So I think that's a little bit of a window beyond that in my experience. And it isn't to say that the steps don't, my sense is each one of the steps allows me to start being honest about what's happening rather than continue to lie about it. And I would say if that's a permissiveness, it's a very generous permission to be able to start to actually make that transition and to notice that. In the third tradition, where we're talking, I mean, it's interesting between this, the steps line up with the traditions pretty much. Third step is we make a decision to turn our life and our will over to the care of whatever that power is. And the idea that we have to make that decision is a little bit absurd because the fact is that power has always been, if that power is infinite, it's always been the power, regardless of what we thought. We're just beginning to be introduced to ideas that align our thinking with how things actually are rather than the delusional nature of the thinking we've been doing that has caused the misery that gave us the impression the best thing we can do is drink ourselves to death or drug ourselves to death or shame and fault others for the things that we're actually doing. If we're doing it individually and we see it collectively, but we're ignoring what we're doing, we're not doing what we can to actually help the rest of that collective heal and grow and be better. But the third tradition says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. Again, a decision. And the point of this is, in our terms, is that emotional sobriety is not conflicted. Any appearance of conflict is over sanity and insanity. These are things that we're imposing on our own experience. Insanity is delusion, which is thinking that what we imagine to be true is true, whether it's true or not. It doesn't make it true to think those things, but there's certainly things we can do, and it offsets this internal conflict, which is some indication to me that we're aware something's wrong. There's a greater awareness to allow that clarity, to have that conflict become obvious is something we're struggling with. Wouldn't happen if it weren't true. If sanity reflects reality, truth, or any absolute nature, whatever that might be, then sanity is our nature too. And to struggle with what we imagine is not based in imagination, but further imagining that what we imagine is true and thus real. It's not the imagination that causes the problem. It's having it become what we think is true and real where the problems begin. That's a choice we make. That's a decision we make. The decision in the third step is to begin to not make that decision and begin to make a decision in favor of something that is principled, that is absolute, that is beyond the limits of any thought. Because in all the terms Bill described, when he talked about creating a God of our own understanding, he always said, as long as you're willing to grow along spiritual lines. Why? Because any limited idea I have is always going to be able to expand. Until my experience was beginning to realize the reason it was always able to expand is because you can't grow anything big enough to actually be infinite, because the infinite is already infinite. It's not a place to get to, it's a place we are. That transition begins to allow what the principles of these steps are actually talking about. In the 12th step, practicing principles in all our affairs, starting to notice this is the basis of our existence. It's not some optional thing because we think it is, and we end up imposing an experience on ourselves as though it is. So opinions like thoughts and ego are only conflicted once we think they're true. Pain and healing only occur in the moment. So if we're creating the problem here, it's where the solution can be reckoned with by beginning to actually concede this. Doesn't mean that we can't have all those other thoughts about all those other things. It means those thoughts will be much more applicable and possible to be seen as something not to fight for, but simply a voyage and an exploration of thought. Nothing can be fixed other than in the present, because that's where everything's broken. So when we're talking about so often about how do I stop it? Well, the question is, why do you want to keep starting it? Wouldn't it be insane to keep starting something you chronically think you want to stop? So my sense, John, is that in some of these greater mental voyages that we'd all love to take, we're sort of undermining the potential to recognize the enormity, and I mean to an infinite level, of the present moment by thinking that we have to straighten our thinking out before we understand things, before they can be true, rather than begin to notice they're already true. And I would say this is the freedom of the steps. On the top of page 45, it says, when we stop fighting everything and everyone, the step before, we react sanely. And it says this happens automatically. We don't have to think about it. It just happens automatically. That's interesting. It says not only do we not have to think about it, that it doesn't exist for us, meaning the delusion has been dispelled. And dispelling things is taking the words off we use to drive the narrative over and over and over again, chronically telling the story about what we think they are rather than what they actually are. My experience. So collectively, my suspicion, which I go with, is that if we talked about that in the immediacy of the moment, which is always immediate, always where we are, always possible, that the revelation that would come from that would be the beginning of expressing an awareness that we've always had and have just subverted by this preoccupation of thinking about our thinking. And that's pretty simple compared to thinking it's as complex as we can make it, and thinking and then feel the complexity is imposed on us in the present, when it's the thinking that we're thinking that's complex in the present that we're married to, in the sense that we think it's true and real and all we can do. And that's typically addiction thinks the only thing we can do is the wrong thing. And as a result of it being the only thing we can do, it's the only thing we end up acting on over and over and over and over again, hoping someday it'll get better. And that starts in thought. The craving isn't just a physical phenomenon. It's a mental phenomenon that impacts the physical experience. It's interesting that for all the 150, 200 different 12-step programs, they all involve craving of some sort. It's not just alcohol. This chronic, wanting to repeat over and over and over again. The same thing, the same fight, the same argument, slight variations, the same thing, the same grudge, the same problem. Doesn't go away in sobriety, because the disease is not cured by recovery from a symptom. The disease becomes very obvious. And if it's not looked at, Bill says, we rest on our laurels, we're looking for trouble. Now, we don't need to look far to find it.
So, as you know, I take notes. So, guys, you know that Jack and I have been talking for, I don't know, like 10 hours or something already. Did you guys knew that?
No, I didn't know that. I was wondering what was going on.
No. We have had 3 discussions on his podcast prior to this.
Oh, okay. Oh,
and so it's very hard for me not to comedy is continuity. So it just seems, anyway. So you use this double negative a lot. It wouldn't happen if it weren't true. So do you guys buy that?
yeah, because usually he picks a pretty safe way. He doesn't say it always, but just on certain, where like absolute things. He says that only for absolute things.
But it's a quote, and he uses it a lot. But Anthony, you buy it?
Yeah.
And you?
Gabe,
Do you buy it?
Yeah, I buy it in the sense that And the example that is most present is my own happening to be affirmative of the conclusion. It's, does that make sense?
Yeah. No, I just wanted your opinions because, you know, we're the audience, right? And, you know, basically hap is, you know, to be. So, you know, like happiness is what you are. And then if you are unhappy, you have made some judgment in your mind about something that makes you unhappy. So I don't buy it.
But that's, you're just restating what I said.
I understand,
Yeah.
but I don't buy it.
Well, it's not for sale.
I'm not,
Yeah.
I'm not, you don't have to make a joke every time I make a point.
I'm not making a joke. You're claiming it needs to be bought, and I'm suggesting if principles are principles, they are the essence of our being and the essence of reality and truth.
Yes,
So it
but
isn't
what
a
I'm
joke
trying
to
what
comment on.
what I'm trying to say is that the statement doesn't have any weight.
Okay, then I would say that's a freeing statement, because I'm not looking to make things matter more. I'm looking to relieve the depression that comes with the ideas we have that make things feel heavy.
No, I understand completely where you're going with it, and but sometimes I need to back up and really look at the statements, because you know, like you and I have discussed for hours, you know, the word nature, you know, and your definition of the word nature.
Well, I would say if the universe has a operating mode, and it seems to for 14 billion years or so, whatever we've calculated, that would be a form of sanity to the degree that it's not insane to be doing what it's doing. And for us, I don't think insanity exists any more than lies exist beyond brains. So it must be something unique to brains that brains are doing to cause those effects. And in the book that says there's a spiritual axiom that whenever we are disturbed, something is wrong with us, no matter the cause. And I suspect what is wrong is the thinking we're doing about what's happening. That's all. It's not complicated, and it's basic. If I'm disturbed, for instance, if I'm trying to hold my breath and make believe that that's going to save me, it's probably not going to take me too long to begin to realize that I need another breath. And that the actual thing I'm doing to save me is actually not saving me at all. And if I was able to hold my breath long enough to pass out, I would naturally start breathing again, because it's part of the organism's nature to breathe, just like drinking water. And if I thought the only meals I needed were the ones I imagined and never actually ate anything, I would again make believe that thinking was real enough to satisfy the basic needs in my experience. And that would undermine my potential to even have an experience, because I would be threatening my death, my physical experience, which I would say is what addiction does. And the mental addiction is what precedes all symptomatic and impulsive, compulsive behavior. So not trying to turn this into a new theology, but beginning to note that if there is a greater awareness and there is an absolute knowing nature, then that nature couldn't exclude us and must then include us if it's natural. If there's something to the word natural, it would typically mean that things natural would be aligned with how things actually are, rather than how they're perceived to be, thought to be, imagined to be, considered to be. That doesn't make them real and true. It just means that we have lucid imaginations, that we're capable of imagining all sorts of things. And the beauty of imagination is to recognize that it's imagined. And it seems to be very conflicted once I begin to make believe that what I've imagined is truth and reality, because it doesn't line up in any applicable way to reality. I can't express it in any way that it works. The expression of it becomes a fight. It becomes a conflict. It becomes a judgment. It becomes a resentment. It becomes an unforgiving attempt to insist and enforce ideas that aren't true in the name of truth and reality, when in fact it's not truth and reality at all I'm trying to claim, but insanity. If the simplicity of the word seeing and hearing things that doesn't exist, I would say is a good definition for insanity. When I'm talking to myself, first of all, I'm thinking there's a self to talk to. And then I'm talking to that self about things that I think are true and real and wonder why I feel heavy and feel conflicted and get angry and get explosive and have things happen that I can't understand and feel happen to me rather than are caused by me. So if there's anything absolute at all, it isn't for sale. It isn't an option. It's not a negotiation. It's absolutely the present state that we've always had and thought we didn't. Just a suggestion. So if the steps have any bearing, they're all heading in the direction of, and again, the third step, the third month we're in, looking at the identity of the disease is starting to admit, if we have it, desire to stop drinking is the only requirement for membership in AA. Nobody can tell us that we're members or not. We make that decision. Nobody can make the decision in the third step for us. We make that decision. We each decide what we're going to do with what's happening. That's the one thing we seem to have that is independent of each other. And yet we all share that. So again, it shows the absolute nature of nature. If we share that chance to be able to say yes, no, can be, can't be, must be, shouldn't be. If those are our choices, that's not something I can do for anyone. And nor can I tell anyone they're insane. I can simply suggest that it is insane to think things that aren't happening are in fact real and true. And it's easy to begin to give examples because there's plenty of people who have witnessed it not only in their own experience, but with others, of people beginning to dispel those rumors and find that all of a sudden they start to act in ways that are much more productive, beneficial, and hopeful to others and helpful to others. Naturally, it just seems to grow in that direction, which I would say is the way nature grows. You plant a seed, and if you take care of it and it's in fertile ground, your expectation is probably something's going to grow. And if you think that seed's an oak tree and it's a walnut seed, it's going to grow a walnut tree. It doesn't matter what we think. So I would say nature is the thing that's actually happening, and delusion and insanity is the thing we think is happening. And I can think that all I want. I'm free to do that. I would say that's a pretty generous source, whatever that source might be, to allow me that freedom. But I'm absolutely never condemned to continue. I'm never condemned to continue the fight. I always choose that fight in the name of thinking I'm right, thinking I need credit to prove that I'm right. I gotta get everybody else's agreement. If there's anything essential, we already share it. We already agree. We don't have to agree with it for it to be. We don't have to fight it for it to be. It is what it is as it is right now. And the present would be a pretty good place to talk about that in, since it's the only place anything has ever happened.
Well, in the present, it's you in the world. You don't control the world. And the only thing you control, in my opinion, is the attitude that you have to what the world presents.
Well, and if that attitude, like in a plane, you can have an attitude in an airplane that isn't right and it will crash. And the point of this conversation is to see that some of the metaphoric things that we use as narratives are all time and space bound, rather than considering that an absolute source never crashes. There's nothing to crash into. There's no dimensional aspects to it, and must also be part of our present experience. That's the transition of the awakening that my sense is the steps are designed, and that history has been asking us to see through all these different, you know better about different religions and the martial arts and all that kind of stuff that I do, that all have principles based in some form of a greater good, a greater wholeness.
Yeah, I do have a basis for judgment on that.
Yes. So now judgment, nothing wrong with judgment, but when we think it's true, that's when the fight begins. Again, we think the thoughts become the definer of truth and reality rather than a surrender to the thoughts and start to concede that, you know what, truth and reality has already always been in existence. It's always been my nature. It's always been the thing I've had essentially, not some vicarious thing that comes and goes. And what I think about it is what I've been conflicted with. That's all. And my greater sense, John, tells me that if we were more open about this, and I'm not saying I am, but if we were collectively, it would be easier to start to come to conclusions that actually reflected what's actually happening in ways that would be profoundly beneficial, that would have been considered impossible and complicated and far off and something we're going to all the time rather than something we're having, because we begin to align with that knowing nature. We'll begin to recognize quicker what those things are that work and what those things are that don't, and start to see the distinction of our awareness has actually been given to us to make those choices in the immediacy of the moment and get better and grow and develop and come upon things we might not have ever expected, because we are no longer married to the idea that only what should happen is what I thought should happen or what I make believe is happening.
So discussion is a method to get to this serendipitous place that you're referring to.
No. If we're already there, we're already there, and it's feeling not serendipitous because of what we're thinking about it. That's all. It's what we're thinking that's the problem. It's just our functional capacity is inhibited and incapacitated, disabled to a degree. When we're thinking things that give weight or matter, we begin to think things are obstructed and that they actually weigh things because we can create that impression on our body. Doesn't mean it's real, it's just imagined.
So if we're all in cahoots and we are all on the same page.
Conspiracy.
So if indeed we are all today, lined up and then how would our conversation be different, Jack?
Well, I would leave it to us to realize that. That's really largely, and thank you, that's the whole point of this conversation, is to begin to look into that, not as a thing that I tell you how it will be, but as something we literally do together by beginning to consider that if the present is the present and we know more than we think and start talking about it, the chances are that conversation is going to feel much more like an adventure and exploration of inclusion than one of demanding and fighting for ideas that are, just stagnant and old and basically attempting to survive in the face of obviously having no real basis. I think it would be naturally, intuitively enlightening. And my sense is that is our nature. That's what we are designed. The reason we use the word brilliance and enlightenment and all that is because we are designed to express light, and it's full of information, just like the light we get from other stars tell us what those stars are made of. When we express that light and start to notice the light is unobstructed, other than our seeming obstructions to it, we start speaking in terms that would be well beyond the limited ideas we seem to fight for and think we need ownership of, when in fact the ownership is the fact that if we haven't identified the problem properly, everything we're doing is bouncing off of the problem we haven't bothered to even concede. It's just like math. If 2 + 2 seems to be 5 at the beginning of a problem in math, that whole problem, no matter how advanced and how beautifully summed up it is going to fail in some respect. And math is a great way to look at this because it's a language that engulfs the entire universe. It's the universal language. And if it isn't done properly, the results are not going to be correct. My sense is the sum total of the moment, if it's already in order, the only disorder is the thinking we're doing that seems to be out of order. Thinking is the primary source we have, rather than a knowing awareness that doesn't require thinking at all, just knows.
But Jack, this is your thing. And for us to understand your thing, which I can speak for myself, I really want to understand your thing. That's why I asked you, what's it like being you? What I'm trying to say is that this discussion, this methodology, this discussion, this openness, this frankness, this positive instead of negative, this, you know, this thing, the way that we are, how do we grasp it, even though you'll say that it's already grasped and so on and so forth? But
So you want to dismiss the answer?
I don't want to dismiss the answer, but what I'm trying to say is that I am inquisitive as to, without discussion, we really don't have anything because we're talking to ourselves.
Well, we've imagined we're talking to a self that doesn't exist. It's just thinking about our thinking that we're doing. So the idea that this is my thing is to suggest it's not exactly what I'm talking about, because what I'm talking about is something that would be our thing. And to begin to consider that, even just consider it, regardless of all the thoughts that rush in to tell you that this can't be true. And in relation to those thoughts, you're right. It can't be true in relation to thoughts that are concluded to be true and concluded to be real and concluded to be who you think you are, because those thoughts have no basis in anything other than what you think as an individual. And you just said, when I'm talking to myself, you're thinking about it as something you do in your own experience rather than something if we can talk to ourselves so readily and think there's a self to talk to, why do we find it so hard to talk openly about the possibility of this rather than just consider it and say, why not just consider it for the moment and just begin to do exactly what the step says, made a decision. Just a decision to say, well, what if it is true? What if the unity of everything is unified? What if the universe is in fact whole and complete? What if the basis of life is not complicated and it isn't hard and it's doing exactly what it's always been doing, exactly the way it's been doing it? And wouldn't that make the problems we're seeming that are so insurmountable something we're simply imposing on our own experience? Wouldn't it be possible that that could be the problem? So I don't think of this as my thing. I talk about it because I suspect it's our thing. And if there is anything, there's nothing to be separate apart. There's nothing to be separate from. We can't be apart from something we're a part of.
But without you, we would not be hearing what you have to say about this, our thing.
So
right, that's why we're sitting here listening to you.
Well, yeah, I talk about it a lot.
Yes. So
I am intent on talking about it. And my sense is that all learning and all human progress has always been beginning to confront things accurately. And when they are, all of a sudden there's a shift that everybody says, well, of course, and stops even thinking about it because they start utilizing it in ways that become so profoundly productive because there's no conflict in it. It just starts, the things that start exactly as we witness in sobriety. Things get better for people in sobriety very quickly. If you take somebody who's been drinking for 20 or 30 years and you get them sober 2 years into it, they look much better than they did starting. And if they were to go out, they would look much worse faster in the same way. They say the disease is progressive, meaning if you stop for 10 years and start drinking, it's as though you never stopped. But in the other end, it's also progressive that when you stop, you get better much quicker because you're no longer infecting a body with something that is undermining its ability to function. Just stopping the alcohol and not drinking is a starting point, or drugs, begins to allow the body to begin to do what it naturally does, which is to heal and recover. I don't have to think about it, but if I am imposing conflicted thinking that led to the idea the best thing I can do is the drinking and the drugging, it means I have this potential in sobriety to keep thinking those thoughts are real and true and wonder why I feel opposed, like opposing things, and I feel like there's conflict going on, inner conflict, emotional turmoil. Everybody else is wrong. I'm finding myself in fights with people that I can't seem to resolve. All the things that benevolence describe can happen well within sobriety.
But you don't just applicate this to sobriety, right?
No, I talk about it because it's some pretty ready evidence that if we can have one experience of surrendering to one thing, that maybe the concept of surrender as a principle would be worth applying to all thinking and all things. And that's what the third step is about. It's the principle in the third step is surrender. And what does that mean? The victor was willing to fight to continue to fight. That's not victory. That's actually giving people credit for continuing to fight and harm. The surrender always brings peace. Interestingly, person who surrenders, while it seems like they're the loser, is actually winning. And so too are everyone else as a result. All those that would otherwise be affected by the fight all of a sudden become less conflicted by that fight, if not conflicted by that fight. So if I can get better and talk about it, and the reason I talk about it is because I want to get better at not only talking about it, I want to get better at expressing it, and I want to get better at being able to do what I can in ways that are productive for other human beings who I see as suffering today in ways that I don't think humanity's really witnessed on the scale, because we have access to the information so immediately. We're witnessing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in our own country on our streets that are basically being written off as only needing houses. They don't need any other help. They don't need any human compassion. They don't need anybody to say hello. We don't need to know who they are. We don't need their names or any kind of understanding of who they're connected to. What we really need to do is give them a condo. I would say this is just another sick venture that will never work and end up institutionalizing and encouraging people to get worse for the sake of getting something for free. That is not what I learned in sobriety. I don't know anybody who got a condo. I know some people who were given a couch, but that couch was only for a week or so, and there was some conditions with that, which was going to meetings and starting to connect and starting to work the steps, starting to do anything proactive enough to indicate their own interest. And that's what the third tradition is. The desire to stop drinking is actually beginning to identify the problem rather than continue to think it's a solution. And that twist of thinking alcohol is a solution, by the way, is the exact same thing I do with denial in my own thinking, to think that more and more and more of my obsessive thinking is going to solve my problems, while in fact the actual consequences of it are apparent. It doesn't, and it hasn't, and it won't. So in a pinpoint of an instance with a symptom, we can see if it's principled, it'll give us a view into the telescopic view from the microscopic focus of what the real problem is. And as far as I'm concerned, it includes everybody who is thinking, to your point. We all have the potential for this. And if we do, there's a chance we're doing it to some degree every day, because like a sailor at sea, they're never on the exact course. They're bobbing and weaving and moving and adjusting. And the whole point of sailing is to learn how to adjust and understand where you're going, not just to be lost at sea until you wash up on a shore somewhere. And if that's what we're doing, I would say our human capacity has been debilitated by this undermining chronic tendency of making believe who we are is only what we think, and actually thinking that we have a self to think to, when all we're doing is thinking about our thoughts. There's nothing wrong with thinking about thoughts, but when all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, I think there's a self inside of me that's distinct from me. Who am I in the sentence to even think I am speaking to myself? I got to be schizophrenic to be doing that. It's not to say I can't think about my thoughts or I can't think to my thoughts or of my thoughts, but it's a very different thing to start letting thoughts be thoughts rather than who I am. And that conflict, my suspicion, has been devastating to human history.
Do you ever have any obsessive thoughts, John? Like mental obsession? That's what the name of this group is.
Oh yes, I mean I live with them. I mean they're like my left foot.
How does your foot feel about that comment?
Jealous.
Jealous. Very good.
Yeah, of course. And you know, I just want to get it. And I think discussion is very, very important, because listening to what and absorbing what other people say, I'm very, very interested in. I've always said, you know, I really like to know how you think, but you
So would
got to
I.
be careful. You got to be careful with words. So, you know, this thinking about thinking, you know, but yeah, to answer your question, Anthony, it's absolutely, it's a big part of my 66 years on the planet.
So in that, John, in terms of the third tradition, that's beginning to identify the problem. The same with the third step. The third step's just a decision. It's not, now I have concluded and I'm always going to feel great. And I've realized that the reality is reality and there's absolutely no conflict. And I'm going to walk out of here a shining light and never interfere. It's a simple decision. You know why? Because that's what we do with our thinking every moment. We're constantly making decisions about what's going on around us, constantly. If we didn't, we'd never act on anything. We'd just be thinking. Decisions are basically precursors to voluntary actions. Eating, breathing, working out, driving somewhere, getting a job. Anything productive we express physically starts with a decision. Choices. So this isn't so much, I know that your reading and your intellect and your academic sort of understanding of a lot of things has been very critical to you. And I don't think there's no discounting of that in this conversation. But on the more intimate basis, that internal struggle is really simple when it's seen for what it is. And yet it seems really complicated when we start using the same thinking to think we're going to solve it and get there, rather than really begin to concede if we're already there, there's nowhere to go, there's nothing to get, and there's nothing to go to. There's no out there. There's, like Gertrude Stein said, a rose is a rose is a rose. The present is present, it's present, period. It isn't somewhere else.
Sorry, and then what is the importance of this discussion if we're already there?
Identifying the disabled, fractured internal conflicts that give us the impression we're not, and starting to see that it's simply a legacy of storytelling about things to try to justify it. And why would we be justifying something that's unjustifiable if we were actually conceding the absolute truth of something? It wouldn't take any thinking at all. And I would suggest at every point in any of our history that we finally realized how something worked, we didn't spend a lot of time thinking of it from that point on. We simply applied it over and over and over again, not compulsively or obsessively or impulsively, but simply because we knew it would work. We knew if we put our left foot in front of our right foot, we could take another step. We knew once we rode a bike how to ride a bike. Didn't take going back through all the fears and all the doubts and all the understanding that it took to get there to finally boom. Why? Because it works. It functions. And it's as simple as that.
No, thank you. That's good. Thank you.
I love your challenge. I mean, you help me understand my own weaknesses in explaining this and my own tendency of thinking I've gotten it across when I don't get challenged.
Yeah.
So I appreciate it. And that to me is the dynamic of our potential, is to use these little chances to say, look, I don't get it. I don't feel, something feels off here. And my experience was when I started experiencing that stuff, I was right. I was just thinking it was out here in the conversation and the world that was off. And I started realizing, oh, that's actually my own greater awareness admitting that I'm off, that I am doing things that are wrong. And boom, all of a sudden, everything shifted. And the reversal of making believe that I can turn the disorder Interesting word, right? All the anxious disorders started making sense because I realized I had thinking first, and I'd get to God somewhere else. I'd get to spirit somewhere else. I'd get to an infinite source somewhere else, sometime else, somewhere else, with something else and somewhere else, somebody else. And I realized, oh, it's here. It isn't anywhere else. It's always been here. And all I've been doing is telling stories to justify the fractured state of my own unwillingness to simply concede the most basic elementary aspects of reality, which is that it's real enough to be real for everything and real for all, always. Not something that's debatable, negotiable, and optional. And all we're doing, as far as I can see, is exactly what sailors did when they realized that the horizon was not the end of anything.
He's going to get into his Columbus shit now.
No, not Columbus, but there was a point when people thought the horizon was doomed. Apparently, I don't know, maybe not.
And
I know that
prior
some
to
of
that, they didn't.
Well, there were, but people who thought that, whoever they were, if it was only one person, saw it as something that was horrifying, when in fact it was the limit of the thought they had about it that was horrifying them. Why? Because they knew better. There is no, you can't even reach the horizon. That's the beautiful irony of the horizon, is the closer you get to it, the further it moves. Every inch you move toward it, it moves. Isn't that interesting? There was no possibility of ever falling off anything. And what does it reveal? That as we move toward it, take action, it proves itself, not because it has a self to prove, it simply proves that it is in fact always the beginning of everything else. It's just the things we don't see that are beyond it. Doesn't mean they're not there, and it doesn't mean they're not seen. They're certainly seen by anyone there, and we can see them as we move toward them. And that, I would say, is a good thought for the thinking we do. The limits we have turn from the beginning of everything else rather than the end of anything. Rather than a defensive posture, having our back toward the outside of that bubble, thinking I've got to secure the bubble of my thoughts and the world I'm maintaining, I turn around and start facing it, and boom, the bubble's gone, and I look into the vastness of everything and start seeing that vastness can't possibly include anything or anyone. And I mean all things. Atoms work perfectly. We struggle with perfection. Interesting. Atoms that don't even think about themselves work perfectly. These small little things, everything out there that's inanimate that we think we're superior to is working absolutely as it's designed all the time, interacting absolutely in benefit of everything else. And we think we're exceptions to that. It's a thought. We can think that. We're perfectly free to have all kinds of thoughts. It just doesn't mean that when I transition from thinking they're true and it's wrong, then I'm going to have some glorious epiphany rather than a very disturbing experience. And my sense is the disturbances and the anxiety and the stress and this bipolarization of things, thinking I can do this and not that. I can accept this, but I can't accept that. Thinking it's up to me to accept it all rather than begin to concede. It doesn't have any impact on what's happening. It has a great impact on my experience and my thinking about what's happening. And I would say that separates sanity from insanity. Laura Alice came a little bit late, but one of the points I was making was that the division between insanity and sanity is making believe that what we think and imagine all of a sudden becomes true, rather than see that we can think anything we want. We're so free to imagine things that when we start imagining without the conflict, that sense of knowing is going to express itself in our thinking, which I suspect is the design of our thinking. It's to express reality and truth. And as we get more used to that, like we've tried to get used to this opposing sense of inner conflict and emotional turmoil, we've tried to make sense out of it through history. We've created 3 egos to help identify why it works. The ego, the id, the super, all this kind of stuff. It just becomes this greater narrative to make sense of something that's insane and has been the whole time. Doesn't mean Freud and all these guys were wrong. It simply means they were doing the best they could to reckon with something that didn't make sense. And they were trying to bring sense to it. Humans have been struggling with trying to make sense for a long time, which is ironic that we talk about there's no common sense when in fact they're right. It's uncommon to make sense. And yet we're always making sense. We just don't make sense of the sense we're making. So it's like, it's so convoluted. And yet it's so simple. It is just so clear and so easy. And our awareness of it, Anthony, and I think this goes to part of your experience now, beginning to see a little bit of it is beginning to concede all of it. And when you begin to concede all of it, the clarity of your own involvement starts to become a little disturbing. Mine was. I had panic attacks for the first time in my life just looking at this when it occurred to me that ego was all made up and I was trying to define it. I was another person in the history of people trying to understand and figure out the ego. And I said, I'm writing a narrative about something that's fictional. What is it? There's nothing there. And boom, my body just turned gray. I had witnessed all the fear I'd had in trying to maintain that. Why would I be witnessing fear if I didn't have some doubt about what I was doing that was greater than the fear I was witnessing? It was my chronic addiction to the idea that this stuff will one day be true if I just manage it longer. While the implications on my body is that all of my bodily systems were being undermined by the stress and anxiety I was creating. They weren't helping me. It was actually killing me in the name of making believe I was going to save myself. That's exactly the definition of addiction. And now I'm doing it in sobriety. And that is not emotional sobriety. That is turmoil inflicted by the same source, making believe that the worse I feel, the better I'll get. Try to put that math together and it would be a little clearer. It's not going to add up. Crazy.
I used to think that I could think my way into feeling better. Right? That's what, if I could just think it through, I would feel better. So I would use thinking as a way of controlling feelings. And once I let go of that, I could just feel the feeling, let it pass, have it, watch it go, and move on. And I didn't have to worry about thinking through it in order to manage it. It's a lot easier to manage.
Think of the word, though, think through it.
Mm-hmm.
We're admitting that it's see-through, that it's an illusion. We're literally speaking of it in terms. When you start looking at your words, you'll start seeing that we've been talking about it openly the whole time, but the connotation has been something else because we all believe it means something else, when in fact the words actually have a meaning of their own. They were designed to mean something, not to mean the opposite for the sake of trying to back up our own crazy ideas, right? But it's interesting. And I used to say to guys, I said, if you think you have a problem, stare at it. Just sit quietly and stare at it and watch what happens. You'll see right through it. It'll just dissipate because you'll be looking at the thinking you're doing with the thinking, and thinking isn't insane. It's how we utilize it that's insane. The same way as it would be if we put a key in the car upside down and thought the car was broken. The whole utilization of that car would be impossible if my thinking was constantly imagining the only way that key is going to fit is upside down. And this reversal is exactly what these disorders are. It's putting thinking first, out of order. Thinking is our source, out of order. If our source is not thinking and we simply concede it, third step, we make a decision. Well, maybe it's worth considering this. Maybe if just making a decision that I turn my will and life over, it doesn't mean I'm going to take that will back and start thinking. And think of self-will. Self-will all of a sudden just becomes what we think. And when you stop thinking of it as the self, you start just saying, I have a desire. What's the desire? To stop drinking in this case. If we identify the problem accurately, we know what to do very quickly. And because accurately assessing anything eliminates the conflict. The conflict is coming from my misapplication of thought, not reality and truth, not love, certainly. But we looked at that last week too, Laura, LA, that just sitting with it and talking about it is very rare. You don't have to pay a therapist to do this. And I learned when I was in therapy, I'd never actually had anybody that I talked to honestly, and I didn't talk to her honestly. I only told her what I wanted to tell her. But the fact that I had a chance to talk to somebody that was actually willing to listen was really exceptional. I mean, it made a huge shift. And, I was in my mid-20s when Gail Sheehy wrote Passages, which was a book that talked about midlife crisis. And at 25, I was absolutely positive as I read it that I was having a midlife crisis. And she said, it generally starts around 42. So I had aged well beyond my years and the wear and tear I'd imposed on my experience. So when we're thinking about our thinking, we can think anything we want. We can desire anything we want. And all of those things become much more possible than making believe they have to be, should be, must be, because they're truth and reality. And that self demands it of us while we're at odds with the self because we know that it doesn't exist. We know that it's just delusion. We know it, we wear it. The weight of depression is an indication that it's a weight. And if the floating nature of being isn't in weight, it isn't in time and space, then that unbearable, what did you say, John, the other day? You texted me, the unbearable lightness of not being?
The unbearable wrongness of being.
Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm thinking who I am is only what I think, I'm literally thinking the sum total of reality has created something dysfunctional and in conflict, and that reality all of a sudden becomes wrong. God hates me. Something else out there is to blame because of the inconceivable idea that it could possibly be me doing this. I would have to be insane to do this to myself. Bingo. Bingo. That's the identification in the third tradition. That identification is nothing anybody can do for us. And it's not until we decide to come to terms with what's actually happening that things begin to open up and the awareness becomes automatic and the confirmation of it. Herb Kagan says that the ego only looks through understanding to make a conclusion, where spirituality becomes obvious once we make the decision. And I'm not talking about any decision saying, well, I'll make the decision to prove it's wrong, because that's a decision to prove it's wrong, rather than actually make the decision and say, look, if it's right, it's right. And if it's real, it's real. And if it's true, it's true. And start to think in absolute terms. That has a major shift in awareness on anyone who's honestly doing it. And when Bill Wilson talked about honesty, he talked about rigorous honesty, because he knew that we thought honesty meant sometimes, somewhere, occasionally. Only when it was seemingly applicable to us, seemingly beneficial to us, not in all circumstances. But he was also describing the principled nature of existence is honest because it's always doing what it's doing as it's doing it, without an opinion, without disrupting its own nature. And I only use nature, John, as something that I would hope might express. Let me just look it up really quick. The natural world as it exists without human beings or civilization is one of the definitions of nature, which is interesting, meaning that if there was something in existence that didn't include us, certainly there was nobody thinking about it to confirm it. That would be one indication that there may be something beyond our thinking.
I like that we're the exclusion to what's natural.
Yes, exactly. Even in the definition, that's beautiful.
Everything but us.
I didn't even see that. Yes. We couldn't possibly be part of nature because we're, but even in the exempting of us, it's pointing out the fact that there's something there that isn't dependent on what we think and didn't start by what we were thinking. It was there. So same as when we're born. Clearly there's a world to be born into. And people don't disappear when we die. If all that I was what I thought, everybody in the world would disappear when I died. But actually, I seem to disappear. And yet I suspect that there is a knowing nature, John. You're doing some research in these out-of-body experiences, and the near-death experiences are seemingly out-of-body experiences. And there are people on this planet that talk about the fact that we really exist back here somewhere, just behind our heads, as observers. Not in it. We think of it in it because that's where our senses are telling us the information we think is all that there is, when all we think is what we think about what is going on. So my sense is we don't have to be near death to witness it. And if we talk about it openly, which would be my goal, is to recognize that we never know when death is coming. It could come right now for any of us. There could be a comet, Generally, we've figured out what those are, but there could be. People tend to die unexpectedly. We say it was unexpected. Well, that's generally the case. Nobody says, you know what? The 25th of April, I'm going to die at 3:34.
Although
It's happened.
people have done that.
Yes. No, we're very intentional. Listen, when I got stabbed, the first question in my head was, is this the day? Very calm. Is this the day? All the days I've
Yeah.
lived, this is how it's, and the voice came back and said, do you want it to be the day?
You know, let's just talk about that for a second. Let's just revisit that for a second, because I don't know if you remember, but I
do.
got off an airplane and had this horrible feeling about you and ran over to a telephone. Oh no, to get a service, I had to get out of the international thing and ran over and called your
Laura.
your telephone. No, I called your phone, I guess, and she picked up.
Yeah.
And I said, what's going on? And that kind of synchronicity. And she was, screaming and yelling, and it was ongoing, or it had just ended.
And then you walked into the hospital room while I was laying on the bed.
Yep. Well, I actually snuck in.
I
That's
know,
not true.
but
Told them I was a doctor.
On 2 feet, you came in and were there within minutes of my arriving there.
Yes.
Now, answer me this. You think that may be a greater sense of knowing than would be
I think
common in an everyday?
It's very synchronistic
Yeah.
deal. It's very odd.
Well, it's probably not odd. It's just unusual given the depreciated methods we've been using to try to attain it when it's always been there. I mean, I get emotional thinking about that day because it wasn't from my experience, because my experience was one of the most clarifying things I'd ever had. It was watching Laura slept on the floor in a cold hospital linoleum floor for 2 days while I was coming out of the surgery and all that stuff. And the impact it had on other people, to me, is what really woke me up, because I realized that none of them could imagine what I went through. And certainly me telling them how profound it was would probably not resolve their concern. But people were really shocked and hurt and wounded and felt afraid and threatened. And I mean, I had guys who I would consider to be pretty strong guys who were really broadsided by the fact that it could happen. Now, I knew it happened and I knew exactly what happened, and I wasn't shy on the experience at all. And I knew I was okay. I didn't know how. And when I came out of surgery and the doctor said, I've never seen anything like this. He said, that knife went 9 inches into your back with the soft side against your vena cava and spine and cut nothing, including your intestines. He said, what they did in surgery to figure out there was nothing wrong was worse than the stabbing. Because they took my entire intestines out. And he said, the knife went through the folds as though it was bent. He said, I've been in Vietnam as a trauma surgeon. I've been here for 18 years. I've never seen anything like it. And he said, the only thing that was chipped off was the tip of your liver. And he went out and asked everybody in the waiting room if I drank. And everybody said no. And he said, because his liver is like pink inside. And I said, well, I like my liver medium rare. Well, I was in this sort of morphine state. But the experience was profound. Really profound. And what was interesting about it was that I really, for the first time, I think, had compassion for the impact on violence. And we're going to do a thing on violence, I know, John, with David. The impact of violence on other people, the families and the friends and all that kind of stuff. But in the more global sense, the impact of violence on society that keeps us all so on guard and so afraid and so pent up, when in fact that tends to be coming from insanity. For us to be a society that seems to expect this and think it's natural is to become accustomed to and to normalize what isn't normal, that's abnormal. Mm-hmm. An addiction is an allergy is an abnormal response to something. What does it mean? When it doesn't work, I do more of it, more of it, more of it, more of it.
Well,
and yet Even interestingly, within allergies, if I have an allergy to peanuts, my throat closes up. I don't tend to eat peanuts again. But when the thing I do makes me feel better, and this is going to your point, LA, about thinking you're going to get better, tends to be that thinking leads to compulsions that give us these temporary senses of relief so we can prove the thinking that we're going to get better by thinking more about it seems to be true, because we do these little compulsive, impulsive, defensive things, thinking I can deny something, and if I'm not paying attention to it, it's not happening. It sets this whole kernel of thinking off. And that's where the compulsions come from. In my experiences, I've never known anybody in sobriety not to have compulsions. And I don't know many people outside of sobriety that don't have compulsions. And I would say when people talk about people being normal, the compulsion of the normal people is the claim that they're normal. It's the constant thinking, not even thinking about it, because they're sitting within the limited framework of the things that have always worked for them, and that's as far as they want to go. Because my experience is when somebody gets pushed a little beyond that, you begin to actually see what's going on inside them, a lot different than when they're functioning within that realm. And in business, it became, you're in real estate, LA. I mean, when somebody's in a deal that means a lot to them, you start seeing sides of them that are very, very difficult, and it can be very traumatic for people to go through that. There's a lot at risk, seemingly. So the role of a broker, given that they're somewhat detached from the immediacy of the import to the individual, is having some broader view to care for and assist in that process. And I imagine to some degree, we all do that with each other, and we're all capable of doing that. We're not actually that good at it. But I suspect if we can get better, it's probably worth talking about. It's probably worth developing in that direction.
Well, the reason that I brought up synchronicities with the knifing and was not to get you jacked up, no pun intended.
No, it just kind of reminded me of the whole thing.
Yes, but the reason I brought it up is because I've been having many, many synchronicities since we started an in-depth look at thinking about your thinking. I've never stopped myself. Well, I've stopped myself all the time, to Anthony's query. I stop myself all the time from thinking about things by verbally saying stop, and I stop briefly. But I have never stopped myself from thinking about my thinking since it happens a lot now since we started these conversations.
So despite the ideas you may have, you're seeing some, I don't even know if it's a benefit. I'll just suggest some phenomenon that is beyond what you normally experience.
Well, I question the word despite.
Despite? Did I use that?
Yes.
Despite your thinking. Is that what I said?
Right, but I don't think my thinking's in the way of me telling myself to stop thinking about my thinking.
No, well, consider that in sobriety, the problem isn't stopping drinking, because we all stopped while we were drinking alcoholic. Druggers all stop. They pass out, they sleep, they do things, they're not doing drugs. It's the restarting that the problem is. So when you think you're stopping it, but you're restarting it, the problem isn't the stopping, it's the restarting. And that's the essence of addiction, is what am I doing now to encourage, to trigger? And if you're witnessing those things, John, I would suggest to you that while you seem to be aware of them, they've always been, if everything is already synchronicitous, then it's always been that way. We just haven't been witnessing it because of this obscuration that we do with the thinking of thinking. The thinking is the source, and the thinking is going to I'm going to use my thinking to think my way through something, when it's the thinking I'm thinking about the thing that's causing the problem I seem to need to get through. That's just a circuit going over and over and over, like the rainbow in the computer when the program's not working. And it does not stop until the program's rebooted. I mean, it's a complete restructuring of the internal systems to have that program begin to work again. It's all got to be reordered. Why? Because it's disordered, it's out of order. So to even notice that and to mention it can undermine a lot of the theoretical ideas we have in the name of what's actually happening, and start to see that reality's always been happening. You're just beginning to witness it. And you're even being able to witness it with the awareness of the doubt you have and the conflicts that you may seem to think are worth investigating. And they may be, for the sake of burning yourself out a little bit further. But generally speaking, what we do is create pain before we're willing to surrender, which is why the book says pain is the touchstone of spiritual growth. We don't, it's the same reason we seem to be near death before we finally go, oh, I have an awareness here that's pretty profound. I can actually see things without my eyes. I can hear things without my ears. I can be aware of things in absolute terms from the ceiling or wherever I seem to be observing it. And yet when I'm in that body, I don't seem to think that's possible. That's an addiction. That's a sickness. It's a mental illness. And what's the solution? Realizing it's only a problem to the degree that we continue to commit to it and maintain it and think of it as real, rather than simply something we're imposing on a system in our body that is dysfunctioning under the weight of us misusing it. To think about thinking is redundant. To express when you were fighting, you probably weren't doing a lot of thinking. You were probably acting through training and experience. Immediately, if you had any thought, it was too late to use it because of the immediacy of the threat of an opponent, the immediacy of the potential of them taking advantage of that slight glimmer of doubt or hesitation. And there's a presence there that is hard to deny. When we're under stress, things get very clear quickly. When we're afraid, real fear, we know exactly what to do, and there's not a lot of thinking going on at all, because thinking is simply being utilized to do everything we can to save us, rather than contemplate what may or may not be. When a bear is running at you, you tend not to, or a car's coming toward you, tend not to have to do a lot of thinking about what to do. Your feet tend to actually be 2 or 3 feet ahead of your body.
Well, there's a separation that occurs between the spontaneous reaction, the things that you have been working on to become not conscious action, which is very slow. But separate from that, there is a cognitive game of your eyeballs registering what the other person is doing, the patterning of them, because everyone patterns. So everyone repeats patterns and repeats patterns and repeats patterns. And when you are sensitive enough to see that, like seeing a visual impression of someone's part of their body that's blue, then your brain is working the whole time while your body is being as spontaneous and subconsciously reacting at the same time.
Well, and I would say that your ability is based on your ability to perceive that correctly. And if you were doubting your own capacity, that would probably be a major component in undermining your ability to have that observation clearly, even if there is a little lag in that. Because I know in the human situation, there's always lag there's always it's not as immediate as something that's immediate, because it is a functional, time-based, space-based vehicle that we're operating, the body.
Conscious action is very slow.
And yet, if you had doubt about your own ability, it would probably cause a major undermining of the potential for you to recognize what the other guy was doing clearly enough to take advantage of it.
Well, I've always had doubt in my own ability. So you're wrong.
I'm not saying it's gone. I'm suggesting that.
I mean, then too.
I'm suggesting that to have it would undermine, to some degree, the capacity to have the clarity.
Yeah, I'm just trying to tell you that there's 2 parts to the thing. The brain is working and is trying to notice things that the other person is doing while the body is in this total embroilment.
Okay, so now we're talking about fighting with another individual. They're at a distance.
Yeah, which is the most difficult thing, because, that's another thinking organism that's possibly better trained and in better shape and a better athlete. And, which I would say that all of my opponents were better than me.
And you still beat them.
I beat a bunch, but the point is that, I had to use my brain, and what I could perceive with my eyes. And that's what we're talking about, that it's a twofold,
Well,
it's a bifold of the mechanism.
so we're talking about two bodies and two brains. And so
No, maybe one body, but it's clearly the mind is doing two things at once. And so I talk about it as a separation. And like near death experience, like out of body experience, there is two brains working.
So you're talking about a greater awareness that would typically be considered our brain.
Yeah. I'm talking about consciousness, two types of consciousness during the fight.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to describe it any better, but if consciousness A and consciousness B are there at the same time, and one consciousness B belongs to the body, consciousness A doesn't.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing that while it seems distinct and different, it may be that consciousness A that seems to belong to the body is actually a part of that other greater awareness.
Yes.
It doesn't seem to be in the body. And that's
yes. No, that's good. Yes.
That's what we're talking about. And starting to see that if there's anything in an absolute sense, there's no division. We do those divisions in our own thinking about it because we think this does this and this does that, and that means they're separate, rather than say, no, this is all part of the same whole, and it's just different ways of noticing and attending to the thoughts we're having about it. But here's the kicker in the whole thing. When the fight is in us, with a self that we think we're going to perfect and beat into submission through self-abuse and self-loathing and self-contempt and all those other things that cause that doubt in us, there's no gap in the immediacy of what's going on, because there's no distance between the pleasure and pain and the thought and the feeling and all of it. It's all happening in the same brain. And there's nothing that can undermine our capacity greater than having that conflict go on as though it's a fight for life, when in fact it's actually a commitment to death. We're literally killing ourselves in suicidal tendencies, undermining our whole body's potential to actually function, which is to maintain homeostasis. That's the nature of a body, to maintain balance. It's always working on maintaining balance, and we undermine its capacity to do that with the instability of our mental condition.
And that, Anthony, is my obsessiveness.
Now, does anyone else think they do that any differently than John? Because if we share something absolute common, we dysfunction in absolutely the same way while we attach different places, times, and faces to it and think that somehow we're unique. We actually have created uniqueness and individuality based on misery and pain rather than absolute nature of love. Wouldn't that be a little diminished capacity to even imagine that that's true and real? No wonder we're embarrassed and shy. Why wouldn't we? I wouldn't want to show my face anymore, certainly not in the mirror.
I'm still stuck on the part where I'm now tracking 3 midlife crises over the course of the last 30 years.
How do you define them?
Is that Sturgis?
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, I don't. Oh, I see the S.
Oh yeah.
How do you define these crises?
Well, interestingly, I think there's a spectrum, in that definition, right? Like they've been different every time, but the one that brought me to the closest point that Jack is describing, or you guys have been chatting about, was the one where I almost died from drugs and alcohol, and that sort of, in some senses, coincided with, there's a sort of new age concept of an astrological concept of returning to Saturn, where you sort of walk through a fire, a spiritual fire, and I think that's really connected to American culture, like at least in the way that I grew up, in that many cultures have intentional fires that are created for the moment in which a boy becomes a man. You go on a walkabout, you fight, you kill, and the only one that we have, which I think is unfortunate in this culture and the way that I grew up, is the military itself. And I don't know how much that served. So those of us who didn't go to the military, and I had a lot of family who did, and I know you guys certainly did and had family that did, were left to our own devices to find a fire to walk through. So I created my own. And that's sort of how I ended up, in one way or another, getting sober. And later, maybe even now, the midlife crisis is more familiar, in the sense that it seems to have more to do with the ennui that every philosopher I've ever read it has talked about since Aristotle, about the difference between seeing your life as an upward slope and then recognizing yourself at the top of it and being able to actually see the horizon line of its end, and how that creates regret, And I think the beautiful thing about a conversation like this is, there's a book I read during the first one by Richard Ford called The Sports Writer. And there's a line that's always stuck in my head from it, which is that you can dream your way through a perfectly fine life and never wake up. And I think that's sort of the line's been stuck in my head since you guys started talking about it, because I think we either create, or these things are presented to us, or perhaps is what we're saying is that it's really both, because it's the same thing. These moments where we wake up, and once we wake up, or as we wake up, our intuition and our senses and our reverence for life and our reverence for what does Aristotle call it? The difference between, ateli and tele, the difference between like doing something and just doing it, like walking or fighting, and doing something for the sake of doing it, like building a house to a means to an end. Those two things become blurred. And that's probably another pretty good way of describing being in the moment.
Well, I think you're tapping into something that really is, you came in a little late, Sturgis, but I went over the third step and the third tradition a little bit. And third tradition is about identification. And my sense is one of the primary problems with addiction is that we each think what we think is our own, when in fact the ownership is that we are each given the freedom to make decisions alone. When I identify those decisions with what's actually happening, I align with things rather than feel disconnected from them and feel that the identity I'm dealing with is separate from it. You follow?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. And you're talking about that ownership. So let me suggest that if the differences you think distinguish those events seem different. It's only in the thinking you're doing about them and the narrative that you tell yourself about those events that aren't happening that seem distinct. But the underlying premise of them would always be the same. And it would always be the same for everyone else too, regardless of whether we think we own it. My feeling is that the reason people don't tend to get sober as soon as they can is because they need their own experience to confirm the problem and their own decision to confirm the problem is the problem before they actually have that awakening and say, oh, this is easy now. Now I see drinking's an option. I could always do it, but I see with perspective what that would mean, what the consequence would be. And when I'm making believe it's something I can do without consequence, and that I can do it in a way that I never seem to do it, I make believe the consequence will never happen.
So I'm tracking, and this reminds me of something that you've reminded me of before, which is that, I often and continue to use people and places and things to give myself the same perspective that, alcohol and drugs gave me.
Yes.
And I continue to go to extraordinary lengths to do it.
Well, congratulations. Because the reason I think Bill said willing to go to any lengths is because he knew we have been going to pretty extraordinary lengths trying to prove that we could do what can't be done. So in a broader thing, this goes to John too. If in fact the differences you think distinguish those experiences as one being better and separate from the other, the real experience you're having in each of them being traumatic or whatever the transitions were and the decisions were, is thinking that they were distinct, thinking that they were unique, thinking that they stand alone, thinking that the story about them is true enough to continue to maintain and think of them and all the differences, when in fact, if it's the differences that identify those things, one thing that's the same is all those things are based on difference. So you're seeing the absolute in the differences. Follow? Just like change. The one thing about change, that it doesn't change. When you look at everything, you begin to see that absolutely everything, if it isn't changing, the thing absolute about it is that everything doesn't change. And now, how do you see that? You see it by incorporating everything as one thing rather than as all things separate. So the struggle begins to dissipate because you're seeing them from a principled standpoint rather than one of division and one of preoccupation with owning them, and begin to own the identity that's actually yours, that is shared by everything and everyone. It's all of ours. Just beginning to concede that. It's a big step when you spend a lifetime carving out these ideas, and carving out is a great example of how we think of it, is that we're kind of creating a cave to live in. And you said the word blurred. The line gets blurred. Of course it's blurred. There is no line. The only line is our imaginary insistence that there's a distinction. So of course it's blurred. And when it gets blurry, you're starting to see it accurately because you're actually starting to lose focus and starting to let go of the attention paid and the investment you've made and all that kind of stuff. And all these guys that have been talking about it, and it goes back to John's comments and some that David made in our conversation recently, is that through history, everybody's been talking about this absolute state of being as something rare and something to get to, rather than beginning to see that we've been aware the whole time. We just didn't think we were. And it's as simple as that. Because if something wrong is complicated, it's only complicated when we keep pursuing the wrong to try to make it right. That's where the complication comes in. It's what Laura Alice was talking about, trying to think her way through to feel better. And the more thinking you do, you feel worse. So what do you need? More thinking. Why? Because it's the thing you think is the solution, because it's the problem. If I admit it's the problem to begin with, I don't keep using it as a solution because I'm aligning with it accurately. I'm owning it for what I'm doing with it rather than what it's doing to me. What seems to be happening to me, what's intractable about these things I can't seem to let go of while I continue to maintain them and restart them. And I've heard lots of people say, I didn't have trouble stopping drinking. It's like people that quit cigarettes. They say, I've done it 10 times. I said, well, you're great at quitting. But you're better at restarting because you have done that at least once more than the times you've quit to be doing it again. And it's this restarting that's the impulse of this thinking process. And it's also the idea that thinking is our sole source. It's all we are. It's all we're ever going to be. It's going to confirm me someday if I just keep thinking more about it, and I'm going to be well and I'm going to be good. And we don't get better at all. We just get better at the division we tend to create and the ideas we tend to develop that are sick, and wonder why we feel sick and nauseous and all that stuff, versus saying, oh, if there's any wrong, it must all essentially have a primary wrong, which is that it isn't right. Very simple, right? So if you put it in the same bowl, in the same envelope, in the same concept, it all of a sudden starts to melt all that stuff, and you begin to see you've had a greater awareness the whole time. Jack Kerouac said, the enlightened man knows he's enlightened. He's always been enlightened. I don't think that was an accident for somebody that was basically a Dharma bum wandering around the country to see that. But he'd also read enough to begin to recognize that. And people have been talking about this. My sense is the aspect of this that hasn't been talked about is that it's a mental illness, and we're literally talking about the balance beam of insanity versus insanity, and seeing that it's actually a choice. It may not be for some people. There may be people predisposed as a result of the chromosomal damage done by the adaptation and the selective nature of experience imposing itself on the chromosomes and our DNA, undermining our ability to actually function in a direction that it developed better solutions for survival while it developed better solutions for not surviving. There are probably people out there who are in those conditions, but I would guarantee you that if we get better as a society, understanding how to help them in meaningful ways that would be successful would grow instantaneously rather than the number of ways that are growing now that are helping people get worse.
One of the things about Kerouac I always think is, and I don't know, the most interesting character to me in all of that series is Neil Cassidy. Who sometimes I wonder if he was just a figment of like Kerouac's imagination. And he keeps showing up everywhere in these scenes, and yet he seems like an example of like pure presence. There's that scene where he's at the Grateful Dead show, and he's looking at Cassidy, and Cassidy he's describing as like bouncing a ball or throwing a ball or something. And he's just one of those guys who is never going to miss, because he's so tuned in so naturally. He's so in touch with synchronicity that he never, ever drops the ball that he's playing with. And, I've always thought about that. I've never brought it up until now, but I've always thought he was a fascinating study. And he shows up, that archetype shows up.
Well, I'll make a suggestion.
I'm all ears.
How we think of everyone is simply how we think of them, not how they are, until we begin to realize that how they actually are is the same as we are, and we start to see it as a unified field. And so making those things up is what we're always doing in relation to our thinking. We're never thinking about the person, we're thinking about the person, right? So in fiction, that would probably be a great tool to take a character that actually he knew and then turn him into everything he thought he was in some way that gave him some ideal to look at his own frailties from, and his own dissatisfactions or his own greatness from. To start to see that in that way, which is probably what all fictional characters are doing to some degree, is trying to replicate. They all seem to emulate like the personality traits of about 70 different people, because they all seem brilliant in a way that doesn't seem common to most people. And yet we probably also have these character traits that we keep to ourselves seemingly and don't quite express. So the literature is just good at sort of giving you a sort of a crossfire of many, many individuals in every body. But that may have been exactly what he was playing off of, Sturgis.
Yeah, I suspect so. I think the brilliant thing he's playing off of is, I think, to your point, the knowingness that we all sort of recognize that character in our life, even though it might change forms. We all have a Neil Cassidy, who we look towards, who's the driver, I think, quote unquote, right? The guy who never dropped the ball. I think that's what's brilliant about it, is he knows that we recognize that character in our own lives.
Exactly. And my suspicion is that's what writing is all about. It's about connecting so that we can see a common nature between us, while in fact we often use it to see it as something distinct from us. It's revealing things we're often not even thinking about that are enlightening, because we're not shining a light in that direction. Typically, we're using other people for perspective. And I would suggest, as we've talked about in here, that all the conflicts I have with others are a chance for me to see the conflicts I'm having. Not in myself, but with my thinking about others. I do my best not to think of that thinking as who I am, so I don't tend to use myself as much as my thoughts. I want to use that as a newer way of addressing the fact that it's my thoughts that I'm thinking about these people. That if I'm not willing to face something, I'm going to be seeing them through the lens of my ideas about what's wrong, and see the wrong in them to give me perspective. And the difference typically is fuck you or thank you. And when I'm not willing to see it as mine, I think it's them doing it to me, and I'm hurting, and they're hurting my feelings, and they're assholes, and why do you keep doing this? And I don't understand, and the whole thing. And what I don't understand, and the asshole is me, my own experience. My imposition on them and demanding of them what I'm unwilling to do is very interesting. And in sobriety, if you think of the difference between carrying the message and not carrying the message, when I start thinking it's up to me to tell someone what they need to know, and they need to listen to me to get better, when I'm actually facing their own unwillingness to listen, I become the culprit in helping them get worse, because I'm helping them build defenses that give them a more righteous idea of what they're doing is right, which prolongs the potential for them to hear anything. That's why he says tried to carry the message. He didn't say carry it. It's up to them to receive. And when they are ready, they will notice they've already received it. They're already aware of it. They've been aware of it a long time because they've been lying about it for a long time. It becomes clear. There's nothing we have to do. That whole thing on the top of page 85, which I think is so brilliantly written and so indicative of this fact. Let me read it really quick. I did it earlier with Anthony. It says, we react sanely and normally after we stop fighting everything and everyone. We find that this has happened automatically. We don't find that it took a whole new layer of construction and redevelopment and new thinking. It happens automatically. Why? Because it's already in place. We will see that our new attitude toward liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. Interesting. Why? Because we're starting to be honest about what's actually happening, and we don't have to think about it at all, because it's always been the case. The only thing we've been thinking about has been complicating it and making believe the thinking was going to solve it, just as Laura Alice said, trying to think my way through it. It says it just comes. No effort or thought on our part. It just comes. This is the miracle of it. And I would say the miracle of it is that we could spend 10 years thinking that our thinking was completely irresponsible for it. Our choice of, that's the miracle, that we could be delusional and make believe that it's reality. The miracle of this is actually realizing this is natural. This is actually how we are when we're not complicating things. We are not fighting it, or neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we have been placed, not that we got to, not that we arrived, not that we took ourselves to. We have been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. What doesn't exist? A delusion, when I stop thinking about it, is true and real. Boom, gone. What is it? A thought. Imagine. What's a thought? Something I'm choosing right now. That's it. Do I have any obligation to continue? None. It says it does not exist for us. Why? Because it's delusional. How can it be real if it's delusional? How can illusions become reality when they become delusional? We are neither cocky nor afraid. All that self-centered fear and all that anxiety and stress is gone. We're not fighting it in that regard. That's our experience. That's how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. And that's leading to step 11, prayer and meditation. So what's fit spiritual condition? Certainly not lying about who we are. I would say that would be a pretty good start. Starting to see that we're not what we think. We just think. We have thoughts. There's something we do. I don't think I'm a butterfly when I start flapping my arms. I've never spent a day thinking that. Or think because I'm thinking of my arm, I become an arm. I'm only an arm. I can't find my other arm. Where is my other arm? I need to get to it. And yet when we think about our thinking, we immediately transition to think we're the creators of reality. Interesting. The most primal thing we do that's unique to us, we turn in something that becomes a complete liability. It's a choice. We are not conflicted by it until we choose to. It is not inflicting itself on us until we choose to see it as something we're not doing, something we're irresponsible for. All of a sudden, it seems to have a life of its own, able to inflict on me an experience that I wouldn't otherwise have. Very clever fiction. Very clever. And yet not so clever as to let us out alive, because it will kill us if we continue, and it's killing people. I mean, disease in a physical sense is undermined. Every bodily system is undermined by stress and anxiety. And what does that mean? Our bodies become less capable of fending for the body and healing, so they become diseased. And that byproduct of, I mean, we're great at pretending that disease is that disease is common while healing is a miracle. You were going to say something, Sturgis?
Oh, I was just saying bye to LA. She sent it.
Yeah. So this has been good. And I appreciate the conversation. I appreciate John's challenges. I know that he has faced many challenges in his life and continues to, like we all do in some respect. And talking about this openly and publicly is, to me, a bastion of opportunity to begin to consider things even slightly different. If we go in any direction that becomes principled and becomes absolute, the freedom starts to become obvious. But I will also mention, so too does the dread and the doubt and the uncertainty and all of the corrupt natures that we thought were naturally who we are. Starting to see that stuff takes a moment, and it can take your breath and be disturbing. But to see it accurately is to dissolve it, rather than think we need to constantly resolve it over and over and over again. See you, Ty.
Seems like when you cease fighting everything.
Go ahead, Loretta.
Oh, it just, it's interesting. I've had this, maybe it was you I was talking about this with. I've had this page 84 and 85 open in the big book for about 3 days. And it just seems like when we cease fighting everything, that, I don't know, for me, I just really started to understand what the present time really is,
Yeah.
And it's not about fighting if you want to live in a good present time.
Well, the option to also see that it's a possibility is the freedom. To see it as something we can't do and shouldn't do and aren't doing is to mean that we never feel disturbed, and we never feel reactive, and we never feel impulsive, and we never have any compulsions. And the fact is, we're all probably struggling with some of those things. So to notice the disturbance is something that's indicative of that fight, even when you don't think you're thinking about that thing, is to begin to actually grow up and start to say, my body's been giving me good feedback the whole time. It's accurate. If I feel doubt, I'm probably thinking something doubtful. If I'm feeling uncertain, I'm probably uncertain about what I'm thinking, and start to see that it's actually clarifying for us rather than condemning us. It's educating us rather than some opposition force that's inside of us that we can't escape.
Exactly.
And that's also, Loretta, in our conversation, starting to see the reactiveness and the irritations and all the presumptions we have about other people. They're all coming from doubt about what we're thinking. Because we wouldn't be spending so much time thinking about other people if we were actually paying attention to what we were doing. We would just be observing them and letting them do what they do, knowing that they have the same freedom we do to think whatever they want and act however they want.
Well, I guess they do.
Yes, ma'am, they do. And there's some relief in that. I would say substantial relief compared to making believe that they should only be doing what I think they should be doing, and so too everyone else. And I've got to mind the business of making sure that everybody else is behaving while I am misbehaving.
Well, just making sure everybody's using their manners, Jack.
Well, I would say, though, that manners, Bill talks about being kind and tolerant, and I don't think he was talking about being dishonest. And honesty is beginning to reckon with what's actually happening. And when we talk about just even grokking what it means not to fight everything and everyone, it doesn't mean because we have that thought that we're not doing it. Because the predisposition of addiction is to keep doing the same thing, thinking somehow you're not even doing it. So there's probably a little bit of blindness going on in all of us. And when we talk about awareness certainly wouldn't include blindness. And to your point also, Sturgis, that the Russian philosopher Gurdjieff, you know him, he said, humans are asleep dreaming they're awake.
Yeah.
And so if we can be in an awakened state in absolute terms, and yet make believe all we are is what we think, we're living within a dream about imagination being reality. That isn't truth, and it isn't enlightened. It's simply a version of what we can create as a fictive narrative rather than one that would be based as an autobiography, literally who we are, when we are. And we would be doing that simultaneously with each other rather than feeling distinct from anyone.
Yeah.
We'd be operating on a much different basis. There wouldn't be the thoughts of scarcity would, the scarce thought creates thoughts of scarcity.
I just texted you a poem, not to open up another rabbit hole at the end of our meeting here, but it's one I meant to text you a couple of weeks ago when we were trading poetry. But it's a Mary Oliver poem that talks. It's sort of an urgent plea to get to it. To get busy living. And it connected to, one of the things I wanted to get into my reaction to John's question was, her note or question is, sometimes we need a little prod. Sometimes we need a little darkness to get going. And I think that's really, really quite interesting as it relates to, the sort of events in our lives that in many ways we create.
I would say in every way.
And I know I certainly did and have and do, as a reminder to get going, as a reminder that there's so much life to live.
Well, and if you embrace a problem wholly, there's no problem. And we're already doing it by being witness to it as though it's our only reality. It's starting to see that we're doing the thing we claim to need to get to. And when we concede it and start thinking it's happening now, the freedom is the responsibility we're having for actually what we've always been doing in what we're doing now, and really embrace it and say, it's only what I think of it now. It's not the story from the past and all these traumas that I experienced and all that stuff. It's what I'm thinking about them now that has an impact. And if I can begin to think about them all simultaneously, I can think about them all equally rather than as divided and separate and something more or less than the other. And this lesson I got from that, and I need this lesson. And all we're doing is looking for reason to solve our problem, which is going to continue to find more reasons, which is exactly why people always say, I did it for good reason. And they're trying to excuse themselves by claiming the good reason is why they just ran into somebody in a car. I didn't know it was, I didn't see, it was an accident. Accidents don't actually happen. What happens actually happens. We cannot be paying attention, but that is no accident when we run into something when we're not paying attention. It's actually a consequence that's pretty typical.
That's so true. Sturgis, if you don't mind, could you tell us the name of the poem? Was it by Mary Allen, you said?
Oh, sure.
Mary Oliver.
It's by Mary Oliver. I think it's a pretty famous poem. It's called The Fourth Sign of the Zodiac, Part 3. Part 3.
Fourth
I don't
sign.
know if I don't believe there are other parts to it. I think
just
it's
sent it to you.
intentional parentheses.
Oh, so
This transition in the moment, in the present, and realizing that everything is everything, ironically, as simple as it is kind of like trying to sit still alone in a room, like Blaise Pascal, one of the most difficult things for humans to do. Why is it difficult? Because we haven't done it well. We haven't let that be our source. We haven't let that be that present place it's always been. We've been thinking about it otherwise through history, and we think that culture dictates the narrative of our reality. It doesn't. The simplicity of it is that there is nothing else. There is nothing else happening. And any imposition of ideas I have that are happening are simply what I'm continuing to maintain in my own thinking.
But Jack, back to the sort of midlife crisis and the
We're starting with the but, so
yeah, but
it's another 2 hours.
Yeah, exactly. And we can kick it to the next one too. I'll give you that option starting right now. But maybe it's an opener for because this is all part of our sort of step 3 exercise, right? It's all a part of reflecting on the act of turning it over, right? And I guess that the direction I think is interesting, is all of those rites of passage that we create for ourselves, whether they're prods of darkness, like Mary Oliver says, or, beautiful reminders or near-death experiences, which feel pretty similar. All of those either serve, but for me, certainly when I'm creating them, they are just like drugs and alcohol were, just like my intent behind that.
Yes.
All of these people and places and things that I'm using to get perspective, that perspective is really, again, another way of saying that is it's a search for a spiritual experience, right?
It's an intoxication.
Well, no, that's not quite what I mean. What I mean is it's an attempt to remind myself or to give myself the perspective of the fact that everything is everything.
Well, but why do you need perspective on something that has no perspective?
I don't, but yet
Okay.
I seem to keep having to remind myself of that. My point.
Yeah. Well, my sense is as you concede it, the nature of it will begin divulging things that you've just been ignoring, that you've always known.
Yes.
And if you're aware of those things, Sturgis, I would say that part of that awareness is what I was saying earlier about the fact that it becomes very disturbing to look at this clearly. Yeah. And what you begin to realize is the seeming depth that we've created out of this darkness that we've created. My sense is if you're looking at something pitch black, you really don't know or pitch white, by the way. If you're looking at absolute light, you have no idea how deep it is. If you're looking in pitch black, it can seem deep because you can't tell any different, but it's really just the veneer of it that you're actually witnessing. And that can seem horrifying. It can seem very scary because we've had this lure and this allegiance to thinking that the dark holds secrets. When in fact, if the secrets are held by it, they're held by it. It doesn't mean we can't see them because they're in the dark, because this kind of seeing we're talking about is a knowing that knows everything. It's not part of this sort of visual game that we can play. But starting to notice that stuff, I would say, is you actually beginning to witness that you're actually beginning to. The better you get at noticing it and saying, wow, I go to great lengths to continue to maintain this stuff that gives me an impression that the absolute truth of everything and reality isn't real or true. Look at the lengths I go. And what I find, my experience, is that circumstance often triggers that, because I use circumstance for so long to try to give me comfort that when it doesn't go the way I think it should, I start recognizing the discomfort I'm feeling that I normally don't think I'm feeling, because I'm relying on circumstance and how well those things are going to guide me.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. And I think, who's that incredible author who wrote, My Struggle, that 9-volume, I can't remember his name. He's incredible. I only got through number 3, but
thank God.
It's quite a piece of work, I will say.
I'll bet.
And I can't believe his name is escaping me. I've sought him out across the world to hear him talk, and I can't remember. I can't believe I can't remember his name. But one of his main points is that it turns out comfort, the kind of comfort I think you're describing we seek, ends up not being that comfortable.
No, what it does is, what you're starting to see is, when you begin to concede the absolute state of serenity, you begin to see the disturbances very, very clearly. But the thing that I began to realize is that I had a lot of opinions about what I liked and didn't like, and whether something was acceptable to me was based on whether I liked it or didn't like it. And what I began to realize is that I don't have to accept it to accept that I can't accept it, and create a relationship to it, that whatever it was, rather than thinking I need now to be happy with this thing that I'm not happy with, just say, I accept that I'm not happy with this, and let that be. Create peace in the moment by my thinking, and begin to address my thinking in ways that allow it to unravel itself. It's not even unraveling itself. It's just, it starts to become unraveled from the enmeshed state I keep weaving it into, like I'm a ball of yarn constantly wrapping another layer around, and the ball gets tighter and tighter and tighter. And the ball actually seems smaller, but it's getting denser and denser and denser. And I consider that the obstacle. It's just imagined. It's literally happening in imagination.
Mm-hmm.
But seeing the disturbance, my friend, is also starting to see that this is going on with everybody to some degree within the human species, and that all of the problems and all the world wars and all the fret and fright and all that stuff has been created as a chance to distract ourselves from what we're doing and make believe it's the only thing we can do, and it's the only thing that's going to happen, so that it becomes the thing that everybody expects and ends up happening. Because what else is there? It's what we say. Well, what else is there is everything else.
Yeah.
And it can be depressing to start looking at it and realizing we're not driving past people who are all well. There is a level of discontent going on and everywhere that is starting to pop up in ways that people cannot find any excuse to. And to find excuse for insanity or to try to reason with it is insane by its own definition.
Jack.
Nausgaard, Carl Ove Nausgaard, or I forget. Thank you.
Yeah. So another thing real quick too, Loretta, Bill says we can have serenity in the face of calamity. He's identifying this absolute state of being that doesn't change when circumstances change and when what we think changes. Thinking is a circumstance because it's the cause of all circumstance and consequence in terms of our experience.
Thank you. Is that in the big book, Jack?
Yes.
I was going to ask you.
Could be the 12 and 12, but I think it's in the big book.
Okay. That's awesome. I was going to ask you, I had an experience that really threw me. And it was, I found this text that I had sent my sponsor, and it was like an apology and an amends. And I thought, what the hell did I write that for? I don't remember us having an argument or anything. So I asked him, he said, well, it must have been a dream. But, it was almost like a complete blackout or dream state
It was about that phone call that you said you texted him, and then he said he didn't get it.
No, this was a different one. But
So you've had multiple dreams.
yeah, maybe so.
Me too, Loretta.
It was a complete blackout. I mean,
Yeah.
was no argument. I don't remember typing this text. And it was really, to be honest with you, quite frightening.
Yeah. Well, listen, what we do when we're insane is absolutely frightening because we're causing fear and pretending it's normal. It's the whole point of insanity. If you go into an insane asylum and says, I'm insane, they'll say, well, you're an outpatient. We're not taking you in. The insane person says, I'm not insane. We are insane to not think we're insane and watch insane things happen and think we have nothing to do with them. And I'm not trying to determine this as a medical diagnosis, but something that's so simple to notice and so simple to see, and that we have been running from it as though we're afraid for our life when it's the life of a thought we have about our thought that we think is who we are, that we're running from. What happens? We get away with it, not from it, by running. It's coming with us it goes with us everywhere our head goes.
Oh, okay.
Because that's where it's centered. And that blindness, Bill Wilson talks about strange mental blank spots or something to that effect in the book. How did I get here? It starts with maintaining any of the conflicted thoughts that we have. And all of those are in opposition to something, Loretta. Even when we think we understand what not fighting anything in any one means, we're still fighting some things in someone, somewhere, often. I'm not going to condemn everybody to that, but I'm going to suggest that if we've been doing it chronically as a species, we've been doing it chronically as a race. And if that's the case, and we haven't seen this clearly, waking up to it is going to be disturbing. And that fear that you described is exactly what I felt when I looked at this accurately one morning and realized I was writing about something that doesn't exist and thought my writing of it clearly enough would finally resolve it. And I thought, that's what I'm doing in my brain. That's insanity. And my whole body turned gray.
Yeah.
I thought I was going to die. I literally thought I was going to die. And my sense is those sensations are coming from a life I think is alive that isn't. What's dying is the ideas I had about who I was. And they had incorporated with them all the impacts on my body of fear and stress and nausea and all that stuff I'd been bearing, trying to make sense of and trying to feel better than, while in fact I was maintaining the same ideas that were causing the actual problem. That's insanity to do that. We are killing ourselves young. And also, to the point you're making, Sturgis, in the poem, to begin living is to begin expressing life rather than this death march we have. My sense is that the real near-death experience is beginning to realize that we are immediately centered in fear of death because the thing we think we are isn't even alive. And we think the investment in more thinking is going to make it alive. It's not even dead. To give it credit to being dead would be to give it credit for having lived. It never lived other than as a delusion. The ideas I have about who I think I am. That's how chronic and central this is. Buddha struggled with it in terms of definition. He talked about attachment and desire for things was the source of suffering. But he was talking about addiction because it's when you have to have the thing that becomes the addictive nature. It's not desire. We can desire to be healthy and sane. That certainly isn't an addiction. But when we desire something and then think our fulfillment is based on getting that thing, it is a sick, sick, sick pursuit to make believe the only thing we need is that thing. And whenever we get it, it's never enough. We need more of it. We need more of something else. We need more of someone else. We need to be somewhere else. The whole thing is fractured into all the different mental dialogues that go on through human history, as far as I can tell.
Wow. Yeah.
So this is no small prospect. While it's as simple as doing what we're doing when we're doing it and starting to notice we've always been doing what we're doing, we've been in that same blindness that you just witnessed. Imagine being able to witness it, Loretta, rather than think it didn't happen. Think of the difference there in terms of insanity versus sanity and awareness. Starting to see it, like you're talking about, Sturgis, starting to witness it is actually an awareness that you're willing to actually start seeing it and say, literally, oh my God, I thought this was my reality. I thought this was my truth. something seriously wrong for me to not even notice what I'm doing and then be able to notice I did it and not even remember doing it. I'm in a blackout while I'm sober. Literally. It's because it's a mental problem. Those things are all metaphors that we do in sobriety. The same way Bill Wilson hammered the bar and said, "How did I get here again?"
Wow.
It's a convenience to Laura L.A.'s point earlier about thinking she could think herself through the problem and get better. It's that kind of thinking that keeps us not even paying attention to what's actually happening from that addictive preoccupation, that when we start to get aware of what's happening, we say, how did that even happen? I didn't even know. It's like we're caught off guard in our own experience about what we're experiencing because of the ability we have to focus so much chronic attention in one direction and pretend that by looking at something exclusively, it means nothing else is happening in the universe. That's a bit of a leap.
Yeah. Wow.
So I would say it's called growth and awareness and coming to terms with what's actually happening. And my experience is that like ice melts in the heat, as you begin to bring the awareness of actual light to things, they begin to melt, dissolve. Literally, the things that seem so hard are basically just frozen from our own ignoring of them, not paying any attention to them. They get cold, just like anything that doesn't get any light. And when you bring the light, they start to melt. And my experience was I had a lot of tears over that. I felt a lot of grief and mourning. And I began to realize I was still carrying all the mourning from all the moments I thought I was in that I missed completely in terms of reality. I didn't miss it, but I missed it in terms of my human experience. And I wore the weight of that.
Right. Wow. Do you think, you
Yes.
told me once about doing the fourth step and that you would go back and go to memories. Did you say that kind of like that? You would pull out memories, and am I on the right track, or was that someone else that said
Go
that?
a little further and help me get some context.
Okay, so we were talking about the fourth step, and I thought you were saying that you would go and find memories, or that memories would come, and
as I unearthed one, I saw other things. Yes.
Right.
As I wrote one down, I would see all of a sudden, I didn't think I had much to say, but as I wrote one down, all of a sudden I would start to think in terms relative to that experience. And this whole world I thought wasn't there, all of a sudden started to open up.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you think if you're thinking about things like that, like you said, and things start to open up, basically we're trying to find the hurt, right? And so
I don't think the hurt's lost if we're experiencing it.
Well, no, I don't either. But if you have past hurt and you sweep it under the rug and it, then you get anger on top of that, building this resentment is what I'm talking about.
Well,
right?
What I'm talking about is that it's always present. It isn't some past hurt. It's the present thing we're doing with that past that hurts.
Okay, exactly. But when you do go back and you're in the present and you do recognize a hurt that began a long time ago, right? Do you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, but you're saying as you go back, I don't see it as going back. I see it as looking at what I'm thinking about that past now.
Okay.
And if I'm thinking of it incorrectly, I'm going to be hurting over it. Period.
Right. Okay. Well, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, but look at the language and you'll see that there's some idea left that the past resides somewhere else other than in the present. And if it resides somewhere else that we can never get to, no wonder we feel it's impossible to deal with it. Because we're not dealing with what's actually happening now about it. We're dealing with what we think we need to go find and that we can't seem to find. Why? Because we're overlooking the immediacy of the absolute present, which is the only thing that actually exists. It's all, the culmination of everything that has ever happened is this present moment.
Right.
Right now, everything everywhere. If somebody moved a rock in a place that no one has been, that rock is still sitting where it was unless it's been washed by water or some other change occurred to move it. Everywhere, everything is the culmination right now of everything that's ever been happened in the present. and all the possibility in this present, given that possibility is always possible in the present, is what the future is seemingly made out of. If I think the future only holds certain things, I will only do those certain things I think the future holds. It's not because the future held them. It's because I held myself hostage to a future that held things.
Right. But, if you're, let's say, with the fourth step, columns 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? In column 2, we're talking about the circumstances, or I can't remember what
What happened?
Huh?
What happened is what we're talking about.
What happened? Right. So, sometimes I can be angry about something, and I'll have to question myself why. Like, why am I so angry about this? How did I get like this?
When you're on a quest, you're
Yeah.
imagining the anger isn't sufficiently giving you information. That's all you need to know. So what you're thinking again is that the answer isn't here. I need to go off on a quest somewhere else. And you're going to launch a new inquisition looking for that answer rather than say, the anger is telling me, it's telling you absolutely that you resent something or someone or regret something or someone, and you've been denying how that has been feeling, and you hurt, you're angry, you're pissed off with what you're doing, not what happened.
Exactly. Okay, I follow that. But I don't know. I've had to question myself, about a lot of things. I just had to go back from when it began, like let's say it's with a child, or and you go back. I had to go back and really to the day when my son was born to find this anger and hurt. So I don't know, maybe I'm doing it backwards, but
no, just Loretta, part of it is that we have a conversation about it because we've been thinking who we are is what we think. We think there's a past that's real rather than just imagined, just like we think there's a self that's real to talk to, that's imagined. And we think there's a future that's real, that's imagined. They're all just concepts of thought, just like lies are and like ego is. They're just concepts of thought. They don't exist in anything other than thought. The culmination of everything we remember is always present. Your memory will get enormously better when you stop thinking about it as somewhere else and start recognizing it's always where you are.
Right. But it wasn't a good thought.
Good or bad, it's the thought you're having, and it would be an indication of things you're nurturing that you don't even think you're doing. Good or bad doesn't qualify reality. It qualifies thinking.
Well, I'm not following you. So I had to ask myself questions to get to.
Let's just say you asked yourself questions. Whether you had to or not is irrelevant. You asked them.
I'm doing the fourth step.
What's that?
This is about the fourth step. I
understand. So you chose to ask those questions to see them in the ways you saw them.
Yeah, to find out, okay, if you do column 2, what happened? What were the circumstances around it?
Right. So it's asking you, what's the story you're going to tell about the circumstances? What's the story?
I don't have a story. I just want like 3 or 4 words to describe it, or a sentence.
Any words that are attached to something that's not happening is a story.
All right. Then I'm looking for reasons, I guess. Why am I feeling like this?
Why ask? Why not just admit you're feeling like that and start to notice that the feeling is a direct relation to something you're doing that's causing it? Start where you are rather than what you're thinking about you need to go and find and look for and all that kind of stuff. The principles are underlying every one of the steps for good reason. Because
how do you do column 2?
What's that?
How would you explain you do column 2 in step 4, which is let's see, let me look it up.
I don't.
Huh?
I don't tend to. I am responsible for everything that happens. When something is occurring to me, I know that I am up to something. When anger is occurring to me, I know that I am doing something that is angering me. When I am sad, I know that I am feeling something that is sad because something I am doing is sad about what's happening. It's not about reality and truth. It's about what I'm thinking about what's happening that's causing that. I start there. The chance of ever knowing any more does not start from convoluting what's actually happening, but starting to address it accurately in the immediacy of our present state, because it's the only place anything is happening.
Right. So with that concept in mind there, when you begin your causes and conditions, which is column 2 in step 4, right? I mean, is that right? Causes and conditions?
I'm going to let you go with your memory and perspective. 'Cause I'm thinking of this principally, Laura. Laura, I'm thinking of this as something that is absolute rather than all the bits and pieces that we can break it down into and think of it in our own way, which is what people tend to do with the program. So I'm looking at the principle. The principle of the step is responsibility.
Right.
I'm responsible, whatever's happening, I'm responsible for. If I start there, I'm already in the 4th column. And the clarity of what happens, I don't need to reconstruct and take apart and come to terms with and come up with new reasons and excuses that I'll have to do the same thing with another week or 2 from now.
Right. I'm not saying analyze it. That's not what I'm saying, because I can't analyze it. And I understand starting from the present moment.
What are you looking for if not some analyzation of it? You're looking for an answer.
No, I'm looking for hurt. That's what I'm.
Why? Why are you looking for it? You hurt. You're already hurting.
Yeah, and I
there to look for?
Well, I want to know why I'm hurting.
Okay, so why not just concede that you're hurting to start with?
Well, I do concede that.
Okay.
To let go of that, I need to. For me, it is easier to ask myself questions to find the root.
But isn't it interesting?
Branch.
You think you're going to let go of it by hanging on to it, rather than just simply saying, I'm hurting, and live with that for a day. Just, I'm hurting. I really feel this. Start there. The windfall, just like I mentioned to you about finding other experiences related to the experiences I wrote down, started to grow. The windfall of information is coming from the immediacy of your willingness to have things as they are right now. Not where you're going to find them, not where you're going to figure them out, not where more thinking is going to solve them. The windfall of information is built into everything. If there's a knowing awareness, it's happening right now, always, 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 where you are, as you are now, period. It's not anywhere else. And if you can begin to concede that, you'll begin to take what's there as it is and start to live with it and embrace it and start to say, oh, maybe this feeling has all the information I need in it. Maybe. Because it's telling you you're hurting. It's giving you evidence something is hurt, period. Why look for it? You've already got it. It's already there. Begin to have it. If you have it, you can let go of it.
I want to let it go.
I got it, but you can't let it go until you have it. And to think of it as somewhere else is to think what's happening isn't happening. And you're discounting the absolute nature of existence and reality in the present by thinking you need to do something else other than have what you have while you're having it.
No, I think discovering something,
You've already discovered it. You're hurting. That's the discovery. You found it. It's not lost. It's there. Period. Same with the anger. It's present. Start living with it, and you'll start seeing that living with it happily by accepting what you're doing rather than what you think you should be doing, it will start divulging information to you that you otherwise think is lost and not found because you're looking everywhere but at the thing actually doing the speaking to you.
Well, I just have a different thought process than you do.
I got it. So I'm not telling you to have my thought process. I'm suggesting that you consider some of these ideas so that you can live with them in a way that may be revelatory to you. Maybe not. I may just be speaking completely backward and in tongues that are completely unintelligible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The job here, third step, is to make a decision. If you can make a decision to turn your will and your life over to the care of God as you understand God, you can make a decision to potentially start to turn your experience over to that same power and start to let it be what it is as it is while you're experiencing it, rather than think that it's up to your thinking that's going to launch a new crusade to find something that isn't missing and isn't lost.
What is step 4 for? I mean, why not skip the step then if you're going to put it to 3? I mean, I'm fine with leaving it at 3. Believe me.
No, I'm not telling you to do anything other than what you're doing. I'm suggesting that
I'm not saying that.
the fourth column is about taking responsibility for everything, period.
And step 4 is completely about yourself, and really and truthfully experiencing or finding how to have a closer contact with God. That's what step 4 is all about.
It's about a closer conscious contact.
However,
Loretta, it's about a closer conscious contact with our thinking about God. We can't have a closer contact with something that's absolutely infinite and immutable and inviolable and indivisible. You can't have any closer contact. It's about what we're thinking about that God that we're correcting. That's what the steps are doing. They are realigning our thinking from lies to something more accurate, where we can begin to actually notice that we actually have a relationship.
Well, I'm using closer as an adjective, not a noun. Okay. So closer means
you think you can be far away.
More awakening, a more of an awakening.
You're already awake. You just don't think you are. It's all thinking that's imposing this impression on you. Nothing more than that, Loretta. Truth and reality do not go away when you think they're not there, or you would be truth and reality.
Are you telling me we're arguing about a word, awakening and awake?
No, I'm suggesting that principles are not negotiable, debatable, or optional. And that if the principle of this step is looked at, you will see that it isn't something that comes and goes because you don't think it's there. Your thinking is what's causing the impression that it's not there, not the thing coming or going. God doesn't come or go because we don't think God is available. It's your thinking that's impacting those, that's creating those impressions that become depressing and frustrating and irritable and discontent because they have no content other than your imagination, that somehow it's up to you to have God get closer. You would have to be more powerful than God for that to be possible.
You know what? Somewhere this got off track because I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay. I know you do. I know you do. So let's talk in those terms.
Let's just swipe this slate clean. I mean, I'm doing a step from the big book. And so in order to do that, I'm following the directions from the big book.
Yes, but you're asking questions about it and I'm giving you my answer.
Well,
That's all I'm doing is offering you my answer, Loretta. I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm not telling you it shouldn't be done the way you're doing it. I'm offering you my answer because I speak as I can in absolute terms rather than try to dissect the relative terms and ideas.
Well, I'll never listen, I gave up dissecting and analyzing a long time ago because
a long time ago means a minute ago, and you were doing a pretty good job of trying to do it just then.
No, I'm not. I am not. I promise to you, because if I'm sounding like that, maybe I'm sounding like that, but that is not how I am. I'm a little.
I know it's not how you are, but I know that it's also how you think, because that's what we're talking about here, is what the impression thinking has on our experience, and the idea that reason is going to save us, we're addicted to. It's not.
I know that. I know about the reason. I know about reason, and I also know about making reason your God. It doesn't work. So I don't really. I think we're bantering about something that doesn't exist but with me. So
I know that it doesn't, but I know that within delusional thoughts it seems to, and that's what we're talking about. So to any degree that those thoughts become preeminent and you need to fight for them and you need to demand I understand them and you need to tell me the story about them, you are representing them as something so true and so real that your life seems to depend on it. And I'm suggesting to you, your life does not depend on them at all. The life of the self you think you are, you think depends on them, And that's where this idea of near-death experience is we're always facing near-death experiences, because we're always, if we're thinking obsessively, we're always facing this chronic nature of who we think we are that has no life in it at all. That's the death we're afraid of facing. It has no life in it at all. It's just a collection of thoughts that we have been reasoning ourselves into thinking will someday prove us to be real and true and whole and perfect, when in fact, it's not true, and it's not whole, and it's not going to be perfect.
Well, good, because I don't, that's
Good is right.
I'm going to be honest with you. I just don't think that much anymore, to tell you the truth.
Well, your words betray that thought.
Well, if they do, then I need to change my words.
No, I would suggest to you, when I suggest, like we talked about the other day, watching your words is not about censoring yourself. It's about starting to watch that you say things that will reveal thoughts you don't even think you're thinking. And if you listen to the words, you'll start realizing they're actually saying things different than you thought the connotation of them was in your own experience. Just listen to the words you use, and you'll start hearing yourself talking about yourself, thinking to myself. I'm thinking to myself, and what is the self you're thinking to but an imagined idea about who you think you are? It's not reality. There is no self to talk to. We are thinking about our thinking when we're doing that. That's it.
And what does it mean when the big book talks about your innermost selves? What does that mean?
Well, he's trying to ask us to become honest about what's actually happening. He also says completely abandon yourself, utterly abandon yourself. He's saying become honest with what you've buried deep inside of you. He also says God is deep inside of everyone. Think of that.
That's what I'm talking about. And what's buried deep inside of you is what I'm talking about with step 4. Because, that's how I'm referring to it.
I understand. I understand that the context is that it seems to be buried. And I would say we wouldn't be aware of it if it was. And those things that seem to be buried, that's sort of a way of describing things that we think aren't happening, just like that thing happened with your text. You were there doing it to have had it happen, and you don't think you were there, which shows how susceptible your thinking is to actually condition to making believe what's happening is only what you think. You seem to be caught off guard by the fact that you did that thing you described, right?
No memory of that.
I got it, but you did it. You were there. You actually did it while you weren't thinking you did it. Doesn't that give you a pretty good indication of how flimsy thinking is in relation to what's actually happening? How clever we can be in making believe that we're not even aware of what's going on by making believe because we don't think it happens and don't think it's happening, and we think it's buried somewhere, that it's actually buried. It's not buried. It's buried under the idea that it's buried. That's it. They're present always. Everything that's happening is present, and we are simply narrowing it down so we can only deal with the things that we want to and like to and think we can and think we should and think we'll be overwhelmed because we've been so underwhelmed for so long. We think this decomposition of our experience and this desensitization, numbness is in fact our reality and the best thing we can do and our purpose here. That's insanity, to diminish our capacity in the name of growth and abundance and life. That is not what life offers. Life offers all of it. Life doesn't, including the chance to be completely, to disintegrate our own experience. That's included in that freedom we're given, but it's not the point and purpose of why we're here and what we're doing.
I think it's an out-of-body experience.
I agree with you. I agree with you. You know why? Because if something isn't based in space and time, it's not in or out of a body. It's not somewhere and not somewhere else. It always seems to be where we are whenever we're willing to notice it. Pretty convenient.
Well, let me tell you, that's not the only one I've had. So I'm just accepting it as, spiritual growth, to tell you the truth. I just don't, and I'm having a lot, of out-of-body experiences. And
I would say your awareness is growing. Consider that, Loretta, is your natural state of being. That is actually your awareness. And all this other stuff you're doing by trying to narrow your awareness down to your attention, paying, and thought conflicts with that. And as you allow that awareness to be your nature and say, that's actually my knowing awareness. I know everything there. I just don't think I know it. If you begin to admit that you know everything there is to know within the I don't know that includes, I would imagine includes everything, but whatever it is that you know the total of, you know. And if you begin to concede that, you'll see that the answers to these quests that you're on that keep looping around and never seem to get unanswered, all of a sudden become obvious rather than something that seems hidden.
That's true.
You turn the flashlight on in a room and all of a sudden you see the things you would otherwise run into thinking they're not there.
Yeah, that's true. I'm trying, what I'm trying to do is make sense of it, because this
Don't. It's already in perfect order and it's already made perfect sense of. The senses you're making are giving you raw data that don't have any opinion at all. It's what you think about your senses that's confusing.
So how do you stay unfrightened? Because, this can be quite frightening. I had the same thing happen at the dentist office. It's like, I just wasn't there. I was there, but I was in a different state.
But do you see how even just now you repeated at least your confirmation that you were there? Rather than saying you weren't there, you actually said, well, I was there. I just didn't think I was. You're starting to see the impact thinking has on your experience. You were there. You were witnessing it. There was just so much you were willing to take, so much you were willing to think of. And largely my experience is that I've maintained ideas about things for so long, I think they're true and real. And all of a sudden, circumstance begins to expose the limits of those thoughts and begin to put me in the face of the fear I've created, maintaining them as though they're reality. As I begin to dissipate that and allow it to dissolve by being honest, I realize that stuff just fades immediately because they're nothing more than illusions or something seemingly in the dark because I'm not paying attention to them. They're still there. They're still what they are. They're still happening now. And the sum total of everything that's happening in me, I'm experiencing now. And to the degree that I think I'm not, is the degree to which I'm using thinking to deny what's actually happening in totality. And thinking will be very happy to accommodate you in every way possible when the limits that you impose on it, that you make believe are true, are all of a sudden no longer, it's what you're doing with it that's creating those impressions. So we're not limited in our awareness if we know everything. If that awareness is intact, it's only what we're thinking about what's happening that's causing the conflict.
So I guess maybe to embrace these things in the present time is the best way to do it, because being fearful, I know, is not going to.
Well, think of this though, Loretta. If you're creating fear, it's an awareness. If you give it credit for being afraid, you're admitting that you know something is wrong that's scary. And the reason it's scary is because it's not supporting your health. It's not supporting your sanity. It's threatening your existence. That's why you're aware of that fear. To try to chase the fear away is like trying to chase the alcohol away while still thinking you have control over it and will enjoy it someday. It's the same thing. You're trying to get rid of the feeling, which is the effect of a cause, and the cause is the thinking.
Right. Well,
as you begin to concede that, you talk about embracing it. When you begin to see that things are the way they are, regardless of what we do with them, they're already that way. The impact is happening as a result of what we're thinking about them, not about how they are. It's about what we're thinking they are only.
Okay.
And then you don't have to embrace them to realize that you're being embraced by them. These are your friends telling you something's wrong by saying, look, your house is on fire. You may want to wake up. They're not saying, I'm sorry to bother you. I know you normally get up at 9 and it's 7. Very sorry for you know what? I'm not even going to mention it because I know you like to sleep in.
Right.
This thing is happening for perfect reason. And we have thought of it as a risk that we are facing. And all of a sudden, by facing it, we magnify it. By paying attention to it, we're starting to notice that our bodies are giving us accurate information of things we're doing that are fearful and threatening us. And to notice that is to start to say, wow, I have been running from my body language that's been speaking accurately about what I'm doing, thinking that the best thing I could do was get over it, get through it, let it go, deny it, somehow or another not have it. When in fact, how can I ever let go of anything I claim not to have? You can't let go of something you don't have, and you won't let go of something you claim not to have. Guaranteed.
Okay.
But all of a sudden, when you realize you have everything anyhow, what's there to let go of? It's got you. It's not you that's holding on to it. It's just the ideas you have in relation to something that is already embracing you. It's already absolutely the fulfillment of everything, every organ in your body, every breath you take, every cell that makes you up is that essence. It's in it all and it's out of it all, because it's not a spatially and time-bound thing. It's an ever-present state of being. We're aware, we wouldn't feel so quickly, we wouldn't know quickly, so quickly what's wrong. And that wrong is a guidance system. It's our GPS system saying, you missed the turn, make a left at the next light. It's just correction here. Make a correction, make an adjustment.
Yeah. I really believe it's more of a spiritual thing, you know.
It's totally spiritual.
So
it's just a word we use for this infinite absolute source.
right. Yeah. So
yes, you're on it. You're on it. And listen, when you're in the middle of the fourth step, and I witness this too, it seems overwhelming because you're being asked for all these details and you literally think you need to drudge it all up. But if you read the book, it says it's looking for resentments. What are we resenting? It doesn't say come up with every experience you've ever had you didn't like and try to rename it and recreate it. And it doesn't say that. This is a moral inventory. You're looking for the morality of your own thinking by looking at the immorality of your thinking. Where are the resentments is what it's really focused on. What's wrong? What did we make out of it? And how can we correct what we made out of it? Forgiveness tends to be part of that. Seeing forgiving is allowing things to be. It's not making them into bigger or smaller things. It's letting them be. That's humility. It's honesty. It's acceptance, all in one.
right.
Responsibility does that by saying, oh, it's what I made of it that I've been struggling with, not what actually even happened. I've been telling a story that's probably changed over the years to help continue to maintain the ideas I have about it that doesn't even represent what happened. And what's happening now is happening now. And what I can do about it now is what I can do about it now, period.
Oh, okay.
If I'm resenting things, that's what I'm looking for in that inventory. Institution, people, places, things, institutions, all of it. What do I resent? Why? Because I hold a grudge against them. Why? Because I think about them as being responsible for something when I've been responsible the whole time for what I've been thinking.
Right, which was what I was trying to say in the beginning with the questions of where did this come from? Why am I feeling this way? And how did, what happened?
Forget about why, is my point. Start to consider that what is happening, and it will leave a lot of the quest searching for something that seems to be missing, that isn't missing, because your relationship to what's happening will be friendly, because at least you're accepting what is happening as what's happening, rather than thinking of it as something that you need to figure out. If what's happening is happening, it's already happening. There's nothing to figure out. Let it be what it is as it is, because it already is. And if hurt is the feeling, embrace it to the degree that you need to use that word to think that you have to hold it, is to simply begin to have a relationship to it that concedes it is what it is, as it is, for whatever reason. Forget the reasons, because we will come up with reasons till we die to try to justify stuff.
Right. I feel like, it's a lot easier when you start with God and you get honest. Period.
Well, you're already starting with God. You're already honest. You're already nature based in truth. So that's already done.
Well,
now the problem is, what are you thinking about it? That's where the source of the problem is.
Right. Yeah. I think being honest was a real key for me.
Yeah. Me too.
But
me too.
When you really have to, getting honest is.
So you know where honesty starts, Loretta?
Right now.
Not in the yes, and not in the circumstances, not in the stories, not in the trying to get it right. It's in noticing, honestly, that the nature of existence is truth and reality. Period. Done. Right. Over. No longer a contest. No longer a question. Absolute guarantee.
Right.
Okay. So if that's the case, and we start being honest there, all the rest of it falls into order perfectly.
Exactly.
Because the disorder will become obvious and you'll see it for what it is, which is simply disordered and acting out of order as a result of something you're thinking about that isn't correct. When you can see it that way, all of those different instances of resentment start to dissipate in the same, they become part of the same context of realizing that it's just my thinking about things in all respects that's been wrong. And all of a sudden, all those little things start to be, and it becomes laughable that we ever took them seriously enough to make believe our life depended on them.
Right. If you want to talk present time, I truthfully think if you're honest, all of these things or whatever root branches and how it talks about that just fall right in front of you.
Exactly. So too with the hurt you're feeling and all the other things you think you need to uncover. They will dissolve automatically because all they've been maintained by is thinking about things incorrectly for years.
Right. It just happens.
Yes, exactly as the book says.
Yeah, it just happens.
Automatically, does not exist for us without any thought or effort, by the way. Remember that we went over that the other day in that top of page 85.
I think it's where the forgiveness comes in, because the concept of God forgiving us, I can understand that. But forgiving yourself enough to. But
the Lord's Prayer doesn't say, God forgive us. It says, forgive us as we forgive others. Why? Because it's our unforgivingness that we're held in contempt by, not God unforgiving us.
Yeah.
How can an absolute source hold us in contempt when it gave us what it has, and what it has must be infinite? It cannot give us a divisive nature. It can give us the potential to choose that, and then that's on us. But it doesn't mean God is holding it against us, and even the Lord's Prayer clearly says that. Forgive us as we forgive others. What's the action in that? What we can do in relation to others. That's what the fourth step is about largely. It's about forgiveness and responsibility.
Yeah.
We've got to end off. We don't have to, but the time is well beyond our norm, and I want to be respectful of listeners.
All righty.
And Loretta, you and I will continue as we have since whenever we started, October or so.
All right. Sounds good to me.
Anthony,
I don't even know a Mrs. Brown, though.
Well, you're going to meet one today.
Mrs. Brown. Who's Mrs. Brown?
Oh, in the book, they show the example of how to.
Yeah, you're right. When you read that, that is hysterical, isn't it?
I don't even know a Mrs. Brown.
Well, like you said, you're going to meet one today.
See you guys. Thank you very much.
I love you. Thanks, Jack. Good job, Loretta. Good job.
Okay.
Yeah, very good, Loretta. Thank you.
Yeah.